Hello, friend. Welcome to Sleepy Old World. Get comfortable. If you're enjoying these stories, a like genuinely helps more than you would guess. And if you would like more nights like this one waiting for you whenever you need them, subscribing costs nothing and means quite a lot to me. That is the entire pitch. I will not bring it up again tonight. What I would truly love to know is where you are listening from right now. Maybe you are in a quiet bedroom somewhere outside Texas, with the air conditioning humming steadily behind the wall. Maybe you are in London, England, with a small fan turning slowly in the corner, just enough to stir the warm night air. Maybe you're lying in the dark somewhere in Toronto with the window cracked, waiting to see if a breeze ever actually shows up. Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. All right, love. Pull the blanket up just enough to feel covered, the way you would if someone else were tucking it in for you. And where do we actually begin on a night like this one? Not with the grand version, the one everybody else reaches for first. Not the Hall of Mirrors. Everybody starts there, and everybody's wrong to. The Hall of Mirrors is the version of Versailles built for people who were never going to live there. The version built for ambassadors and coronations and photographs taken 200 years later. The real Versailles, the one a woman actually woke up inside of, begins in a bedroom so small and so crowded with other people that you would not be able to turn around in it without touching someone. It is just past 7 in the morning, sometime in the early 1770s, and a woman is lying in a bed with curtains of pale blue silk pulled halfway back, and she is entirely awake, and she has not been permitted to get up. Maybe she's 19, newly arrived from a smaller court where mornings belong to her alone. Maybe she's 34, a duchess by marriage who has done this every day for so long that she barely registers the strangeness of it anymore. Someone who married into a name so old that her own family, though wealthy, felt almost common by comparison. Whichever woman she is lying still, because the first rule of the day is that she does not move until the correct person has come to help her not move, if that makes any sense. It does not really. That is rather the point. There is a particular sound that opens the day at Versailles, a sound most people never think to imagine. It is the sound of a latch, then a second latch, then the soft scrape of a door that has been opened this exact way at this exact hour for longer than anyone currently living there has been alive. A servant enters first, always a servant, to open the shutters exactly enough and no more, because there is a correct amount of daylight for a woman of rank to wake into, and someone, somewhere, decided what that amount was 100 years earlier, and nobody has thought to question it since. Here is the detail that stops people cold every time I tell it, and I still find it almost impossible to sit with. This woman, whoever she is, wealthy beyond anything most of us will ever touch, dressed within the hour in silk that costs more than a labourer earns in a year, is not permitted to hand herself her own shift. Not the outer gown, not the jewels, not even the plain linen undergarment she will wear closest to her skin. Someone else's hands do that, and whose hands, on any given morning, depends on a ladder of rank so exact and so jealously guarded that women have wept actual tears, actual furious tears, over being the second person to touch a garment instead of the first. That is Versailles in one sentence, if you want it in one sentence. A world so wealthy it could buy almost anything, and so rigid that it could not buy its own women 5 private minutes to get dressed. Let me tell you what actually happened during what the court called the toilette, because the word sounds gentle in English now, almost spa-like, and what it meant at Versailles was something else entirely. It was a performance. It was some mornings a performance with an audience of 30 people or more standing in a bedroom watching a woman put on her underclothes. And I do not mean that as an exaggeration. I mean it literally, and I want to sit with you in that fact for a moment before we move past it. The lever, the getting up, happened in stages, and the stages had names, and the names mattered enormously to the people involved, even though almost nobody outside that world would recognise a single one of them today. There was a smaller, earlier stage where only the most senior women were present, women whose blood or marriage put them at the very top of the household, and there was a second, larger stage where the doors opened further and more of the court filed in. And by the time the third stage arrived, the room could genuinely be crowded with courtiers who had come simply to be seen being present, because being seen at the toilette of a great lady was itself a form of currency at Versailles, a way of proving you mattered enough to be let in the door. Here is the story that captures it best, and it comes down to us through the memoirs of a woman named Henriette Campan, who served as a lady in the Queen's household, and who wrote about all of this with the dry, slightly exhausted precision of someone who had lived it. One winter morning, the Queen was standing by the fire, entirely undressed, waiting for her shift, the plain linen garment worn against the skin, to be handed to her so that the actual dressing could begin. The shift was already in the hands of a lady of the bedchamber, ready to be presented, and then, at that exact moment, a woman of higher rank entered the room. And by the rules that nobody in that room had the authority to simply set aside no matter how cold the Queen was standing there, the shift had to be handed back and represented by the higher-ranking woman instead. Except then a third woman entered, higher still. The Queen stood there, undressed, shivering, according to Campan's account, visibly shivering, murmuring under her breath that this was tiresome, while the shift was passed from hand to hand to hand like some kind of relay race nobody had asked for, each new arrival outranking the last, until finally the correct person, the highest-ranking woman in the room, was allowed to place it over the Queen's head. Campan writes that the Queen was, and I am paraphrasing rather than quoting her exact words, both amused and irritated by the absurdity of it, and that she said something to the effect of what a bother it all was. And it was a bother. It was also completely unavoidable, because at Versailles rank did not bend for comfort, not even the Queen's own comfort, not even for something as basic as staying warm while getting dressed on a winter morning. I find myself genuinely struck by that story every time I come back to it, because it tells you something the paintings never do. We look at portraits of 18th century queens and aristocrats draped in silk and diamonds, and we imagine unlimited power, unlimited ease. And in some ways that is true. But there is another truth sitting right alongside it, which is that the same system that dressed these women in extraordinary wealth also stripped them of the smallest, most ordinary freedoms, the freedom to simply put on your own shirt when you're cold. Wealth at Versailles did not buy privacy. If anything, it bought its exact opposite. Once the shift was on, the actual architecture of the day's dress began. And it really is architecture. There is no better word for it. First came the stays, a stiffened bodice boned with whalebone that laced up the back and pulled the torso into the long, smooth, upright line that 18th century fashion demanded. This was not the extreme tight lacing that later centuries would become famous for, the corset of the 1850s that could not be laced without help and could barely allow a full breath. The stays of Marie Antoinette's Versailles were firm but somewhat more forgiving, meant to create posture and shape, rather than to crush the waist into an impossible number. Still, a woman could not lace herself into them alone, not fully, not correctly, and so the hands that tightened those laces belonged once again to someone else. Over the stays came the panniers, the wide hoops of whalebone or wicker that held the skirts out to the sides in that unmistakable 18th century silhouette, wider than a doorway in the most formal court dresses, wide enough that women developed an entire choreography for moving through rooms sideways, for sitting down without the frame flipping up in front, for simply existing in a hallway without knocking a candlestick off a table. The grandest court gowns, the ones worn for presentation, or for the most formal occasions, used panniers so extreme that a woman could not sit in an ordinary chair. Furniture at Versailles was built around this problem. Some chairs had no arms at all, specifically so that a woman's skirts could spread beside her, instead of being crushed against wooden rails. And then finally the gown itself. A robe à la Française, cut with that distinctive flat panel of fabric falling loose from the shoulders down the back, called a watteau pli, or a robe à l'anglaise, more fitted through the body, depending on the fashion of that particular year and the occasion of that particular day. The fabric was silk, always silk for anyone of real means, often brocaded with metallic thread, sometimes embroidered by hand with hundreds of tiny flowers or vines that could take a single embroiderer weeks to complete on one panel alone. A single formal court gown, fully trimmed, fully embroidered, could represent months of skilled labour before a single stitch of it ever touched the woman who would wear it. Let us talk about what this actually cost, because I think the number is more useful than any description of the silk itself, and it is the kind of number that should genuinely stop you for a second. A single elaborate court gown for a woman of high rank could run anywhere from several hundred to well over 1,000 livres, and to put that livre figure into some kind of human perspective, a skilled tradesman in Paris at that time, a carpenter, a mason, a man with a real trade and steady work, might earn somewhere in the range of 1 to 2 livres a day. Do the arithmetic, and a single dress, one dress, hanging in one wardrobe among dozens of others, could represent close to a year of a working man's wages. And a woman of real consequence at court did not own one such dress. She owned many because appearing in the same gown twice in front of the same audience was, depending on the occasion, its own quiet social embarrassment. There was a real woman behind a great deal of this spending, and I want to tell you about her because she deserves to be more than a footnote. Her name was Rose Bertin, and she was not born to any rank at all. She was the daughter of a provincial policeman, and through sheer talent and nerve she rose to become the Queen's chosen marchand de mode, her fashion merchant, a role that placed her, remarkably for someone of her birth, in private audiences with Marie Antoinette on a near-weekly basis. Bertin's workshop on the Rue Saint-Honoré in Paris became something close to a second court in miniature. Other noblewomen would wait for hours simply for an appointment, because what Bertin made for the Queen this season was what all of fashionable France would want to be seen wearing the next. The Queen's private wardrobe accounts, the ones her household was required to keep, ballooned so dramatically under Bertin's influence that by some years the sum spent specifically on clothing and trimming ran into the hundreds of thousands of livres, a figure so far beyond any ordinary household's imagination that later, when the Revolution came looking for grievances, the Queen's wardrobe bills were read aloud in pamphlets as proof of a monarchy entirely disconnected from the hunger of its own people. Whether that reading was entirely fair or not is a longer conversation than we have time for tonight, but the anger was not invented from nothing. The numbers were real. While the gown was being fitted and pinned into place, the hair had already begun, often hours earlier, because the hairstyles of this particular court reached heights, quite literally, that required real time and real engineering. The Queen's hairdresser, a man named Léonard Autier, became almost as famous in his own right as any noblewoman he served, and his creations, built up over wire frames and false hair, and sometimes stiffened with pomade and powder into towers a foot or more above the natural hairline, could take upward of 2 or 3 hours to construct properly. These were not everyday styles. The towering ones were saved for the most formal court occasions. But even an ordinary morning's hair, powdered white or pale grey, with a fine cosmetic powder made from starch, required real skill, real time, and a servant whose entire job, some days, was simply hair. The powder itself is worth pausing on, because it is one of those small physical details that tells you something true about the whole world it belonged to. It was applied with a bellows or a puff, while the woman sat wrapped in a loose paper or cloth cone to protect the gown beneath, and the air in a Versailles dressing room on a morning of heavy powdering would have had a fine white haze to it, a faint dry smell, something between flour and chalk, settling on every surface in the room, including, more than occasionally, on the servants doing the powdering. And once the hair was done and the powder settled, a light colour went onto the cheeks, a bright, almost theatrical circle of rouge, because pale rouged cheeks were the fashionable standard of the day, a look that would strike modern eyes as almost doll-like, but which read, in that room, in that century, as the height of aristocratic refinement. Jewellery came last, and here again the numbers do something strange to your sense of scale if you actually sit with them. A single pair of diamond earrings suitable for court could cost tens of thousands of livres. A parure, the matched set of necklace, earrings and bracelets that a truly wealthy woman might wear together for a formal evening, could represent a sum that would have purchased a comfortable townhouse outright, and these were not locked away and worn once a decade. Court etiquette expected visible, appropriate jewellery nearly every day, more on Sundays, more still on the feast days and ceremonial occasions that dotted the Versailles calendar with a frequency most of us would find exhausting. A woman of rank did not really choose whether to wear diamonds. She chose which diamonds, on which day, for which specific occasion, and getting that choice wrong, wearing something too plain for the moment, or, worse, something too grand for her actual rank relative to the company, was its own small social catastrophe, noticed and quietly discussed by everyone present. By the time all of this was finished, the stays, the panniers, the gown, the hair, the powder, the rouge, the jewels, A woman had usually been in the hands of other people for somewhere between 2 and 4 hours, sometimes longer on a day of particular ceremony, and it was still not yet noon. Breakfast, by comparison, was almost an afterthought, and I find that detail quietly funny every time I come back to it. After all that architecture, all that labour, all those hours of other people's hands on her body, breakfast itself was often small. A cup of chocolate, thick and sweetened, sometimes flavoured with vanilla or orange flower water, drunk from cups so fine they were nearly translucent when held to the light. Perhaps a roll, perhaps nothing solid at all. The grand meal of the day, the meal that mattered, the meal where Versailles truly performed itself for an audience, was still hours away. Between breakfast and that grand meal, there was correspondence, and there was mass, and there was, on many mornings, a walk. Letters at Versailles were a genuine social instrument, not a chore. A woman of consequence might have correspondence scattered across half of Europe, other courts, other relatives, other women bound to her by marriage or politics or simple long friendship, and maintaining those threads required real daily attention, real time at a writing desk with a quill and good paper and wax and a seal that identified exactly who she was to whoever opened the letter weeks later in Vienna or Naples or London. Then came Mass, attended daily in the palace's own chapel, a soaring space of white stone and gold that the king and queen and their household filed into on a kind of visible, ritualized schedule, watched, as everything at Versailles was watched, by whichever courtiers and visitors had gathered that morning simply to observe the royal family at prayer. Even faith at Versailles had an audience. Now let us slow down here for a moment, because we have arrived at the part of the day I think you actually came for tonight, the part that sounds, on paper, almost impossible to believe, and yet it happened, day after day, year after year, exactly as I am about to describe it. Dinner at Versailles was often a public spectacle, not a private meal shared quietly between a husband and wife at a table behind closed doors, the way we might picture royal dining today, but an event with an actual audience, actual strangers, standing and watching while the king and queen ate. It had a name, this ritual. It was called the Grand Couvert, and it is, once you understand what it actually involved, one of the strangest and most telling details of the entire Versailles system. Picture the room, a long table, set with a formality that would take a modern household staff a full day to replicate, silver and gold plate catching the candlelight, a chair for the king, a chair for the queen, seated together at this table in full view, and behind a low barrier, a railing, sometimes simply a rope, stood the audience. Courtiers, naturally, the nobility who had every right and every expectation of proximity to the royal family, but also, and this is the detail that tends to genuinely surprise people when they hear it for the first time, ordinary visitors. Versailles operated, for much of this period, under rules that allowed reasonably well-dressed members of the public, provided they met a basic standard of appearance, a hat, a sword for men, nothing too shabby, to walk into the palace and watch the King and Queen of France eat their dinner. Think about that for a moment. Think about what that actually means. A farmer's son from outside Paris, or a merchant visiting the city on business, could, with the right coat and the right hat rented for the day, if he did not own one, walk through the gates of the most powerful palace in Europe and stand within a few short paces of the King of France while he lifted a spoon of soup to his mouth. There was no equivalent anywhere else on the continent, not really, no other monarchy that had built its own dining table into something so close to a form of public theatre. And I want to be honest with you about something. Historians still argue about exactly how open this access truly was in practice, whether it was quite as freely available to just anyone as popular legend later suggested. But the core fact holds up under real scrutiny. The King and Queen of France ate significant meals in front of witnesses on a regular and expected basis, as a matter of established court ritual, not as an occasional novelty. Now imagine being the Queen at that table. Every motion watched, every bite counted, in the sense that courtiers genuinely did notice and comment on, and sometimes gossip about, how much or how little a royal woman ate at these public meals, what dishes she reached for and which she waved away, whether she seemed in good spirits or subdued, whether she spoke to the king warmly or barely at all. A meal, for anyone else in the world, is one of the few remaining moments of the day that stays private even inside a fairly public life. At Versailles, for the Queen, it was the opposite. It was one of the most exposed hours she had, the etiquette governing who could sit, who could stand, who could speak, and in what order dishes were served, was extraordinarily precise, and it had built up over generations, refined and re-refined, by courtiers whose entire social position depended on knowing these rules better than the person standing next to them. Certain members of the royal family were entitled to sit at the grand couvert table. Others, even quite senior nobility, were only entitled to stand and watch. A whole silent hierarchy was visible in nothing more than who was seated and who was not, legible to everyone in that room the instant they walked in, the way a modern person might read someone's job title off a name badge without a word being exchanged. Course after course, on formal occasions, could run to dozens of separate dishes, though of course no single person, not even the king, ate more than a fraction of what was actually presented. This was, in its own way, the point. Abundance itself was part of the performance. Course after course would be carried in and set down with real ceremony, soups and roasted meats and elaborate pastries and fruit brought from the palace's own hothouses in the depths of winter, oranges and pineapples that had cost a genuine fortune in fuel and glass and gardener's labour to coax into ripeness in a climate that had no business producing them at all. Much of what was served was removed largely untouched, and what was not eaten by the royal family did not simply vanish, it moved down through the household in its own quiet hierarchy, feeding first the most senior servants, then further down the chain, a kind of trickle-down banquet that everyone at Versailles understood without ever needing it explained. For the Queen personally, the grand couvert was not the only meal of her day, and by no means always the most comfortable one. Marie Antoinette, by most accounts from those who served closely around her, found the full formality of the ritual genuinely wearing over time, and as her years at Versailles went on, she increasingly sought out smaller, more private meals among a close circle of favoured friends, taken away from the public gaze whenever the demands of ceremony allowed it. This preference for privacy, for a smaller table and fewer witnesses, was itself read by much of the wider court as a kind of quiet rebellion, a woman stepping just slightly outside the visible, sanctioned rhythm of Versailles, and it did not go unnoticed, and it did not go uncriticized. Even choosing to eat dinner with only a handful of trusted friends, rather than in front of a railing full of strangers, could become, at that particular court, a political statement. I find that almost unbearably sad, if I am honest with you. A woman with more wealth at her personal disposal than nearly anyone alive on the continent, and one of the very few things she seemed to genuinely want, a quiet meal with people she actually liked, was treated by the world around her as an act of defiance. After the grand couvert, in the stretch of afternoon that a modern person might call free time, the wealthy women of Versailles turned, more often than almost anything else, to cards. Gambling was not a minor amusement tucked into the corners of court life. It was, for long stretches of the 18th century, one of its central occupations, and the sums that moved across those card tables on an ordinary afternoon would startle anyone hearing about it for the first time. Games like Lansquent and Ferrion, fast-paced card games built almost entirely around chance rather than skill, were the fashionable choice, and fashionable is really the right word, because the specific game in vogue could shift from season to season the same way a hemline might. Stakes at the more serious tables could run into the thousands of livres in a single evening, and the Queen herself, by the accounts of nearly everyone who wrote about her, had a genuine taste for it, gathering with a close circle of favoured companions around tables that sometimes stayed lit and occupied well past midnight. There is a particularly well-known account of one New Year's Eve, sometime in the earlier years of her reign, when gambling at the palace ran so late and so intensely that professional card players, and even, by some accounts, individuals of rather questionable reputation from Paris, were let into the palace specifically because the stakes had grown high enough to require players willing to hold that much money on the table. The king, by most tellings, was uneasy about the whole affair, and eventually the play was shut down for the night, but not before considerable sums had already changed hands. What strikes me most about this, and I want to be honest that it strikes me as something close to tragic, rather than simply extravagant, is what it reveals about the actual texture of the Queen's days. Here was a woman surrounded on every side, from the moment she opened her eyes, by ritual, by rank, by rules she had not written and could not set aside. Cards, unlike almost everything else in her schedule, were something she chose. Nobody assigned her to the card table the way they assigned her to the toilet or the grand couvert. And so she went there, again and again, to a room where the outcome was at least genuinely uncertain, where rank did not determine who won a hand, where for a few hours the future was not already written by 200 years of custom. Maybe that is too generous a reading. Maybe it was simply boredom, simply the restless energy of a young woman with far more free time in the strict sense than most people her age, filling the hours the only way this particular world had made available to her. I suspect it was both things at once, the way most human behavior usually is both things at once. Beyond the card tables, afternoons at Versailles unfolded in the gardens, and this is worth its own moment, because the gardens themselves were as much a stage as any drawing room inside the palace. Designed decades earlier under Louis XIV by the landscape architect André Lenat, with their long geometric alleys of clipped trees, their fountains that ran on an elaborate hydraulic system fed by water pumped uphill from the River Seine at genuinely enormous expense, and their statuary imported and commissioned from across Europe. The gardens were built to be walked through slowly, to be seen in, group by group, along paths wide enough for skirts 3 or 4 feet across to pass one another, without a single fold of silk touching the gravel. A promenade through those gardens on a fine afternoon was, again, a social performance dressed up as leisure. Who walked beside whom, who paused to speak with whom, and for how long, whether the Queen herself appeared, and if she did, who she chose to walk near, and who she passed with only a nod. Courtiers who had travelled considerable distances and spent considerable sums simply to be present at Versailles could spend an entire afternoon in these gardens without a single meaningful word exchanged with anyone of real consequence, and would go home that evening having accomplished, in the strange economy of that court, essentially nothing at all. Let us step back from the Queen herself for a moment and look at the women around her, because Marie Antoinette was, however famous, only the single brightest point in a vast constellation of wealthy women who lived and moved through Versailles, and their lives, while less scrutinized by history, followed much the same punishing arithmetic of expense and etiquette. The household around the Queen alone employed dozens of noblewomen in formally ranked positions, and the titles tell you almost everything about how seriously rank was taken. At the very top stood the Dame d'Honneur, the highest-ranking lady of the household, a position of real political weight, held for most of Marie Antoinette's early years by the Comtesse de Noailles, a woman so exacting in her knowledge of court protocol that the young Queen, only a teenager when she arrived from Austria, privately nicknamed her Madame Etiquette, not entirely as a compliment. Below her came the Dames du Palais, ladies of the palace, a rotating group of noblewomen who attended the Queen on a schedule, and below them again came the femmes de chambre, the women of the bedchamber, whose duties were more intimate and more constant, closer to the Queen's actual daily body and needs, and lowest in formal rank, though not necessarily lowest in genuine trust or affection. A woman appointed to any of these positions, even a modest one, was expected to maintain a wardrobe and appearance suitable to appearing daily in the Queen's presence, which meant that simply holding a court position, an honour many families spent years and considerable sums manoeuvring to secure, came with its own steep and unavoidable price tag. A Dame du Palais, with a comfortable but not enormous personal fortune, could find a significant share of her annual income consumed simply by the gowns, the jewellery, and the general appearance required to avoid embarrassing herself, and by extension her family, in front of the entire court. There are letters and household accounts surviving from families of exactly this rank complaining, in careful, restrained 18th century language, about precisely this problem, the honour of a court position and the crushing expense of actually holding it, arriving very much as a package deal. Maybe she is a woman like this, a baroness, let us say, married into a family with land but not enormous liquid wealth, whose husband secured her a minor position within the Queen's household through a distant cousin's influence and years of careful correspondence. She arrived at Versailles genuinely thrilled, genuinely honoured, and within 18 months found herself quietly writing to her husband about dressmakers' bills that had grown far larger than either of them had anticipated, phrased delicately, apologetically, because complaining too openly about the cost of court life was itself a kind of social error, a sign that perhaps her family did not truly belong there after all. This is the detail that I think gets lost most often in the popular imagination of Versailles. The idea that everyone inside those gates was simply, straightforwardly, obscenely rich, unbothered by money in any real sense. Some were. Many were not really, not once you account for what the position actually cost them to maintain. Versailles did not just display wealth, it consumed it, steadily, relentlessly, gown by gown, card game by card game, and a family's fortune could be very seriously diminished by a single generation of maintaining a foothold there, even while that same family looked, from the outside, more magnificent than it had ever looked before. Friendship at Versailles, real friendship, the kind with genuine warmth in it, was almost as politically loaded as anything else in that world, and nowhere is that clearer than in the Queen's relationships with two women in particular, the Princesse de Lamballe and the Duchesse de Polignac. The Princesse de Lamballe came first, a young widow of gentle temperament who Marie Antoinette grew close to not long after arriving at Versailles, and whose position was eventually formalized when the Queen revived, specifically for her, the largely dormant office of superintendent of the household, a post that came with real income, real precedence, and real resentment from other noblewomen who felt, not without reason, that the appointment had bypassed the usual channels of seniority and merit entirely, and been handed out on nothing more than personal fondness. That resentment tells you something true about Versailles. Favour was its own currency, arguably more valuable than money itself in certain rooms, because favour could be converted into money, into position, into influence over who got which apartment and whose daughter got presented at court and when, in a way that raw wealth on its own sometimes could not. Later came the Duchesse de Polignac, and the friendship there ran even deeper and even more expensively. The Queen showered the Polignac family with pensions, appointments, and honours over the years, sums that when totaled by critics at the time and used against the crown in the growing wave of pamphlet literature that would eventually help fuel the revolution, ran into the millions of livres across the extended family, a figure that, whether entirely accurate or somewhat inflated by hostile pamphleteers, became one of the sharpest weapons used against the Queen's public reputation in the years before 1789. Here is the part nobody talks about enough. It is entirely possible, and most serious historians now believe, that the Queen's affection for both these women was genuine, warm, uncalculated in the way real friendship usually is, and it is equally true that this genuine affection, expressed through the only currency Versailles really understood, money, position, precedence, did lasting and serious damage to how she was perceived by a public already primed to resent extravagance at the top, while bread prices climbed at the bottom. Visits between noblewomen in the afternoon hours followed their own quiet etiquette too, smaller in scale than the grand rituals of the toilette or the couvert, but no less carefully observed. A call paid to another lady's apartments came with expected timing, expected duration, expected topics, and a woman who overstayed her welcome, or who called too rarely on someone whose friendship mattered to her social position, could damage a relationship as surely as any open insult. These visits were where the real information of the court actually moved, who was in favour this month and who was falling out of it, whose daughter had just been presented and whose marriage negotiations were quietly collapsing, which minister the king had spoken with longest at yesterday's council, and what that might mean for next season's appointments. A skilled woman of the court could learn more in 40 minutes of carefully directed conversation over chocolate in someone's private sitting room than an ambassador might learn in a week of formal correspondence, and the truly capable women at Versailles knew this and used it, quietly, without ever appearing to be doing anything more than making polite conversation. As the afternoon light began to slant lower through the tall windows of the state apartments, the day's rhythm shifted again toward the evening entertainments that made Versailles, whatever its cruelties, also a genuinely dazzling place to witness firsthand. Several nights a week, depending on the season and the calendar of the court, There was theatre or opera or a concert, staged either in the palace's own opera house, a jewel box of a room finished in blue and gold that had been completed only shortly before Marie Antoinette's arrival in France, or in one of the smaller private theatres scattered through the palace and its surrounding estates. The opera house itself deserves a moment of its own attention, because it was, by the engineering standards of its day, a small marvel. Built under the direction of the architect Anne-Jacques Gabriel, its floor could actually be raised on a system of hidden machinery to the level of the stage, transforming the entire hall from a theatre into a flat ballroom in the space of a single night, which meant the same magnificent room could host an opera at 8 in the evening and a full formal ball by 11, an astonishing bit of 18th century stagecraft that most visitors never fully appreciated because they never saw the mechanism itself, only its result. A woman attending an evening at the opera house dressed differently than she had for the grand couvert or the afternoon promenade. And this is another detail that surprises people. The sheer number of times a single wealthy woman at Versailles might change her entire ensemble across one day. Morning dress for the toilette and breakfast, a different, generally somewhat richer gown for the grand couvert and any formal daytime audiences, something suited to walking for the garden promenade if the weather and the day's schedule allowed for one, and then, in the evening, a full formal court gown again, often with fresh jewels, sometimes with a fresh application of powder to the hair if the earlier style had begun to soften or fall. Multiply the cost of a single elaborate gown, which we discussed earlier, by 3 or 4 changes across a single day. Multiply that again across 365 days a year, and you begin to understand why the household accounts of a genuinely wealthy Versailles family could run to sums that would have supported an entire village of ordinary people for a generation. The ball itself, when the opera house floor was raised and the orchestra struck up something livelier, was where a different kind of skill mattered, because dancing at Versailles was not the loose, casual movement we might picture from a modern party. The minuet, the dance most associated with high formality at this court, was slow, precise, almost geometric, performed one couple at a time in front of the assembled room while everyone else watched, which meant that a woman's dancing, like everything else about her, was itself under quiet, continuous evaluation. Dancing masters were engaged for young noblewomen years before they ever set foot at court specifically to prepare them for this moment, the moment of stepping out alone in front of hundreds of watching eyes and performing a dance whose every angle of the wrist and tilt of the head had been considered, practiced and judged correct or incorrect by generations of court tradition before she was ever born. Stay with me here, because I think this detail matters. Even joy, even something as simple as dancing at a ball, arrived at Versailles wrapped in layers of performance and evaluation that most of us, most nights, never have to think about at all. We dance, if we dance, because the music moves us and nobody much cares how our wrist is angled while we do it. A woman dancing the minuet at Versailles in 1775 was doing something closer to a public examination dressed up as pleasure, and she had likely spent years of her childhood preparing for that exact examination. One single minuet, performed once, watched by everyone who mattered. Not every day at Versailles followed this exact rhythm, and it is worth pausing here to talk about the place the Queen built specifically to escape it, because the contrast tells you almost as much about the main palace as the palace itself does. In 1774, within months of her husband's accession to the throne, Louis XVI gave Marie Antoinette the Petit Trianon, a smaller chateau on the grounds of Versailles that had originally been built decades earlier for one of Louis XV's mistresses. It was, by the standards of the main palace, almost modest, a compact, elegantly proportioned house that a wealthy but not royal family might have lived in comfortably, and the Queen made it hers in a way she had never quite been permitted to make any room in the main chateau her own. She redesigned the surrounding gardens away from the strict geometric formality of Lenote's grand design towards something new and fashionable across Europe at that moment, the Jardin Anglais, the English garden, with winding paths instead of straight avenues, artificial streams that curved as though nature itself had put them there, and a small temple of love set among trees that seemed deliberately, almost accidentally beautiful, rather than mathematically arranged. And then, in the mid-1780s, she went further still, and had built at real and eventually much criticised expense the Hameau de la Reine, the Queen's Hamlet, a cluster of picturesque cottages designed to look, from the outside, like a humble Norman farming village, complete with a working dairy, a mill, and livestock, actual cows and goats and chickens, tended by actual farmers, all constructed and maintained for the pleasure of a queen who could, whenever she wished, walk down from her private rooms and play, quite literally, at being a simple countrywoman for an afternoon. I want to be careful with you here, because this detail gets told two very different ways depending on who is telling it, and I think the honest version sits somewhere between both. On one side, this looks like the purest kind of tone-deaf extravagance, a queen so removed from ordinary hardship that she built an elaborate, expensive fantasy of poverty to entertain herself, at a moment when actual rural poverty across France was worsening by the year. That reading is not wrong. The Hameau cost a genuinely significant sum, and its existence was mocked and weaponized by critics almost from the moment it was built. But there is another layer sitting underneath that first one, which is that the woman building this fantasy of a simple, private, unwatched life was doing so specifically because the life she actually had, the one we have spent this entire evening walking through, the shift passed hand to hand across a freezing room, the public dinners behind a railing, the years of being evaluated on the angle of her wrist during a single dance, had genuinely worn on her in ways that the people mocking her from a distance rarely stopped to consider. She was not hungry. Nobody around her was starving. That distinction matters and should never be minimized or explained away. But she was, in a much narrower and more specific sense, profoundly unfree, and the Petit Trianon and its little farm village were, whatever else they were, also the closest thing to an actual private life that this particular woman had ever been permitted to construct for herself in her entire adult existence. At the Petit Trianon, she set new, stricter rules of her own. Even the king, by several contemporary accounts, was expected to be formally invited before entering certain parts of it, a small telling reversal of the entire logic of Versailles, where a queen usually had no such power to keep anyone out of any room she occupied. Here is the part of this story that I think explains, more than any single other episode, why the numbers we have been discussing tonight mattered so much beyond the walls of the palace itself. In the mid-1780s, a scandal broke that came to be known as the Affair of the Diamond Necklace, and though the Queen herself was, as it turned out, entirely innocent of the fraud at its centre, the affair did more damage to her public reputation than almost anything she had actually done. The story, briefly, involves an extraordinarily expensive diamond necklace, originally commissioned years earlier for one of Louis XV's mistresses at a price so enormous, reportedly close to 2 million livres, that after that mistress died, the jewellers were left holding it, desperate to sell it to anyone of sufficient wealth, and increasingly desperate as the years went by without a buyer. A woman named Jeanne de la Motte, a con artist of real skill and real nerve, convinced a gullible and socially ambitious Cardinal de Rohan, that the Queen secretly desired the necklace but could not be seen purchasing something so extravagant openly, and that he could win back the Queen's favour, which he badly wanted, by arranging its purchase on her behalf in secret. He believed her. He arranged the purchase, using forged letters supposedly from the Queen herself, and the necklace was handed over and promptly broken apart and sold piece by piece on the black market, largely in London, while the Cardinal was left holding a debt to the jewellers that the Queen had never actually authorised and knew nothing about until the scheme unravelled entirely. When the truth came out, and a very public trial followed in 1786, the Queen was formally cleared of any wrongdoing, and it did not matter at all in the end, to her public reputation, that a scheme this elaborate, involving a diamond necklace worth roughly 2 million livres, could even plausibly be constructed around the idea that the Queen might secretly want such a thing told the French public everything they already suspected about the scale of wealth swirling around her, whether she had personally spent a single livre of it or not. The affair became shorthand in pamphlets and gossip, and eventually in outright revolutionary propaganda, for a monarchy so awash in extravagant sums that a 2 million livre necklace was, to the public imagination, an entirely believable royal purchase. Marie Antoinette's actual innocence in the fraud made almost no difference to how the story was used against her in the years that followed. The number itself had already done the damage. the same way the wardrobe bills and the card table losses and the pensions to the Polignac family had already done their own quiet damage, some by some, pamphlet by pamphlet, in the years leading up to 1789. I find that genuinely instructive, sitting here now, so many years later. It was never really about whether any single expense was, on its own, unreasonable by the standards of that particular court and that particular century. Every single one of the costs we have walked through tonight, the gowns, the diamonds, the card table stakes, the pensions to favoured friends, would have looked entirely ordinary to anyone who had grown up inside Versailles and had no other world to compare it to. It only became a crisis of reputation once the numbers escaped the palace walls and reached people whose entire year's income would not have covered a single evening's candles in the state apartments, and once those people had, for reasons that had very little to do with the Queen personally, begun to run out of patience with the whole arrangement. Let us slow down now and stay a while longer inside one particular evening, because I want you to actually feel this room rather than simply be told about it. It is deep autumn, sometime in the late 1770s, and the state apartments are lit for what the court called an apartment evening, a gathering of music and cards and quiet conversation that filled several of the grand rooms at once, each one doing something slightly different, so that a guest could wander from a room of chamber music into a room of card tables, into a room where couples were dancing, all within the same building, all within the same hour. The smell in these rooms was distinct and layered, and if you had been there you would have noticed it before you noticed almost anything else. Beeswax candles, hundreds of them, burning in gilded sconces and crystal chandeliers, gave off a warm, faintly honeyed smell entirely different from the cheaper tallow candles burned in ordinary households, which smelled of rendered animal fat and left a greasy smoke in the air. A single evening's candles in the state apartments could cost a genuinely staggering sum, and the choice of beeswax over tallow was itself, in its own small way, another quiet advertisement of wealth, because the smell of the room told you, before your eyes had even adjusted to the light, exactly what kind of household you had walked into. Underneath the candle wax sat other smells, layered and shifting as you moved through the crowd. The heavy floral sweetness of perfumed powder rising off dozens of elaborately dressed heads, the sharper, warmer scent of pomade in the men's hair. Somewhere beneath all of it, faint but never quite gone, the smell of too many silk-clad bodies standing close together in rooms without the ventilation a modern building would have, warmed further by all those hundreds of candles burning at once. Versailles in full evening splendour was, by every account that survives from people who were actually there, extraordinarily beautiful and, quite often, extraordinarily warm, in the uncomfortable sense as much as the pleasant one. The sound mattered too. Silk against silk, a particular dry whispering rustle that filled any room where a dozen or more women in full court dress moved at once, underneath the music, underneath the low murmur of conversation pitched carefully to the exact volume that suggested intimacy without actually inviting anyone nearby to listen in. Heeled shoes on parquet and marble, a light constant clicking that never quite stopped as long as the room stayed full, and laughter, real laughter, because whatever else Versailles was, it was also, for many of the people inside it on any given evening, genuinely enjoyable, genuinely full of wit and music and the particular pleasure of being young and beautifully dressed in a beautifully lit room among people who, for a few hours at least, were simply glad of each other's company. A woman standing in the middle of one of these rooms, halfway through her evening, might have felt something very close to what any of us feel at a party that is going well, warm, a little tired in the pleasant way, glad she came, and also, somewhere underneath all of that, faintly aware, the way you are always faintly aware of your own posture in a room full of mirrors, that she was still, even now, even here, being watched, being measured, being placed, quietly and continuously, somewhere on a scale that never really switched itself off. And then, eventually, however late the evening had run, there was the coucher, the going to bed, and it mirrored the Livres we began this evening with almost exactly in reverse. And I think it is worth walking through because it closes the circle of the day in a way that tells you something true about the whole system. The same hierarchy of hands that had dressed a woman that morning now undressed her that night, in roughly the same order, the highest-ranking woman present handling the most significant garments, the jewels removed and returned to their cases by whoever held that specific privilege, the hair unpinned and brushed out by whoever's role that particular task belonged to. For the Queen specifically, the courtier could still draw an audience, smaller than the mornings, generally the deepest hours of night thinning out even the most devoted courtiers, but present nonetheless, because Versailles did not really distinguish between a private moment and a public one in the way we do now. There was no hour of the day, strictly speaking, that belonged entirely to the Queen alone, no moment written into the actual structure of her life, where the doors simply closed and nobody else was owed a view of what happened next. Even so, something did shift once the last formal step of the couture was complete, and the final curtain around the bed itself was drawn. The attending women withdrew to the outer rooms, where several of them, depending on rank and duty and the particular arrangements of that specific year, would sleep near enough to be summoned instantly if needed, close enough to hear a bell, a call, the faintest disturbance. And behind the drawn curtain, finally, alone in the narrow, private sense that alone had ever really been available to her, a woman who had been watched, dressed, evaluated and performed at almost without pause since 7 that morning, closed her eyes. I think about that specific moment more than almost any other detail from this whole story. Not the diamonds, not the 2 million livre necklace, not even the freezing shift passed hand to hand across the room. Just that. The curtain drawn. The candles finally out, all but perhaps one left burning low nearby. The sound of the outer room settling into its own quiet, women murmuring instructions to each other for the morning, a door closing somewhere down the corridor, footsteps fading, and in that narrow, dark, curtained space, for a handful of hours before the shutters would be opened again and the whole extraordinary machine would start over, something close to actual privacy, something close to rest. There was one more layer of this public life that I think deserves its own quiet mention, because it is perhaps the single clearest example of just how far the absence of privacy extended at Versailles, further even than the dinners and the toilette, into the most intimate moment a woman can experience. When Marie Antoinette gave birth to her first child in December of 1778, after 8 years of marriage and considerable public anxiety over the delay, French royal tradition required that the birth itself be witnessed openly by members of the court, a custom rooted in the old fear that a royal succession could otherwise be quietly falsified, a stranger's infant smuggled in to claim a throne it had no blood right to. And so, when the moment finally came, the Queen's bedchamber filled, not with a handful of trusted attendants, but with a genuine crowd, courtiers and curious onlookers pressing in from the corridor, climbing onto furniture by some accounts to get a clearer view, until the room grew so hot and so crowded that the Queen, already exhausted and in real physical distress, briefly lost consciousness, and the doctor attending her had to call for the windows to be forced open, in the dead of a French December, simply so she could breathe. The birth itself went on to be, by most accounts, safe, and the child, a daughter, Marie Thérèse, survived and was healthy. But the Queen's own reaction to the ordeal of that crowded, airless room was strong enough that the custom of a fully open birth chamber was significantly curtailed for her subsequent children, a small but genuine victory carved out of one of the most exposed moments any woman in that palace ever endured, and one of the few instances where the sheer physical danger of the tradition became undeniable enough that even Versailles agreed to bend. I think about that scene often, the crowd pressing forward, the heat, the windows finally thrown open to a winter night, and I find it says something true that no gown or diamond necklace quite manages to say on its own. This was a world that had built an entire civilization out of watching itself, out of never quite letting go of the idea that someone of consequence should always be observed, and it had built that civilization so thoroughly, so completely, that it very nearly cost a young mother her life simply by refusing to leave her alone in the one moment that most needed stillness and air. Not everything about a wealthy woman's day at Versailles happened indoors, and I want to give you at least one scene of open air before we settle further into the evening, because the contrast matters. Hunting was one of the few pursuits at this court that women of the highest rank could participate in directly, rather than simply observe, and Marie Antoinette, in her earlier years at Versailles particularly, took to it with genuine enthusiasm, riding out with the royal hunt in a specially designed riding habit, cut close through the bodice in a masculine style that scandalized some of the more conservative older courtiers, precisely because it hinted, ever so slightly, at trousers that a woman's leg suggested rather than entirely concealed beneath endless yards of skirt. The Queen preferred for a time to ride astride rather than side saddle when the hunt itself allowed for it, a small but genuinely provocative departure from convention that her own mother, watching anxiously from Vienna through the reports of ambassadors, wrote to scold her about more than once. A hunting day began early, often before the sun was fully up, with a very different wardrobe than any we have discussed so far, wool and leather rather than silk, boots instead of the delicate embroidered slippers worn indoors, hair simply dressed and covered rather than powdered and built into an architectural statement. The forests around Versailles, vast tracts of land maintained specifically for royal hunting, still exist in something close to their 18th century form today, and the sound of horns and hounds and the particular thundering hush of a large mounted party moving through old trees was, for a few hours at least, about as far from the airless crowd of the grand couvert as this world had to offer, and yet even hunting carried its own quiet hierarchy. Who rode near the king, who was invited on which specific day's hunt, and who was not, whether a woman's horsemanship was admired or quietly criticized within earshot of people who mattered. There was, it seems, genuinely no corner of this life entirely free of evaluation, but I think the hunt came closer than almost anything else, if only because the forest itself, unlike a mirrored gallery, does not particularly care who is watching whom. The court's calendar was not fixed permanently to Versailles either, and this too shaped the year in ways worth mentioning. Autumn often meant a move to Fontainebleau, a somewhat older chateau southeast of Paris, for weeks of hunting in its own surrounding forests. Other seasons might bring shorter stays at Compiègne, or at the smaller, more intimate Château de Saint-Cloud, which the Queen would eventually purchase largely for her own use, seeking again, in a pattern you have probably noticed by now, a house just slightly smaller and slightly less watched than the one she had been given by birth into this position. Each of these moves required transporting not just the immediate royal family, but a significant portion of the entire household. Furniture, wardrobes, servants, all shifted across the French countryside, on a schedule that had been more or less fixed by tradition long before any of the people actually making the journey had been born. None of this, the walking, the dancing, the precise angle of a curtsy, the ability to hold a fork correctly through 11 courses without a single visible flicker of boredom, arrived naturally. It was taught, deliberately and often quite early, and I think it is worth spending a few minutes on how a girl actually became the kind of woman capable of surviving, let alone thriving, inside a world built this precisely. A daughter born into a family with any real hope of a life at court began her education toward that life well before she could reasonably be expected to understand what any of it was for. Dancing masters were engaged for girls as young as 6 or 7, teaching not just the steps of the minuet, but the exact posture of the neck, the precise distance to hold the elbows from the body, the specific rhythm of a curtsy performed to a person of higher rank versus one performed to an equal, a distinction so fine that an untrained eye, even today, would likely never notice the difference, and yet an 18th century courtier would have read it instantly, correctly, and without a moment's hesitation. Reading and writing came alongside this, along with religious instruction, a working knowledge of French history and genealogy, because knowing precisely how one family connected to another by blood or marriage across 3 or 4 generations was not idle trivia at Versailles. It was practical, load-bearing knowledge, the kind of thing that determined who outranked whom in a doorway, and therefore who entered first. Music lessons generally, harpsichord or voice, sometimes both, because a young woman who could perform competently at an evening gathering carried real social value beyond her marriage ability alone. And needlework, endless needlework, not merely as an idle pastime but as a genuine valued skill, fine embroidery being one of the few forms of visible, admirable labor a noblewoman was permitted to display in public without any loss of status attached to it. Marriage itself, for almost every woman of this class, arrived as an arrangement rather than a choice, negotiated between families with an attention to land, title, and financial advantage that could feel, to modern ears, almost entirely bloodless, though the surviving letters between many of these families suggest that genuine affection, even genuine love, sometimes grew afterward, slowly, out of proximity and shared circumstance, rather than preceding the match itself. A dowry, the sum or property a bride's family provided at marriage, could run to genuinely enormous figures for the great aristocratic houses, sometimes hundreds of thousands of livres, negotiated over months by lawyers and relatives on both sides with the same careful, unsentimental precision that might today accompany a major corporate merger, because in a very real sense, that is closer to what it actually was. And then, if the family's rank and connections were sufficient, came presentation at court, the formal moment a young woman was introduced to the king and queen, and through that introduction to the wider society of Versailles itself, an event so significant that a single wrongly executed curtsy during the presentation, and there were 3 of them required, performed in careful sequence while walking backward, without ever once looking down at one's own feet, could become a story repeated and enjoyed at her expense for years afterward. Some young women, by multiple surviving accounts, trained specifically for those 3 curtsies alone, for weeks beforehand, practicing the backward walk across a marked floor, in private, until the whole sequence had become close enough to automatic that nerves, on the actual day, would not be allowed to undo it. Let us meet one more woman before we go further, because I think her perspective rounds out something the Queen's story alone cannot quite give you. Maybe she is a woman well past 50, a marquise who first arrived at Versailles as a young bride during the reign of Louis XV, decades before Marie Antoinette ever set foot in France at all, and who has, by this point in our evening, watched an entire generation of fashion favourites and etiquette shift and reshape itself around her while she remained, more or less exactly where she started, a fixture of the household, respected, occasionally consulted, gradually less central than she once was, but never quite dismissed either. Women like her existed in real numbers at Versailles, and their long view of the place is, in some ways, more clear-eyed than anyone freshly arrived could ever manage. She remembers, because she was there, the earlier reign, the earlier queen, the earlier set of favourites and scandals, each one that felt, in its moment, like the most significant thing that had ever happened at court, and each one that faded, in time, into exactly the kind of half-remembered anecdote that younger courtiers now traded about her own generation without fully believing it had ever been real. She has outlived at least one husband. She has arranged at least one daughter's marriage, using precisely the same cold, careful calculations her own parents once used to arrange hers, and felt, doing it, a complicated mixture of guilt and relief that she has never fully worked out how to name. She still attends the toilette most mornings, though her own rank now places her further back in the room than it once did, a demotion nobody announces out loud, but that she reads clearly enough in where she is asked to stand. I find her a genuinely moving figure to imagine, more moving in some ways than the Queen herself, because she represents something the Queen, dying young as she eventually would, never got the chance to become, a woman who simply continued, who watched the machine keep turning long after her own particular moment inside it had quietly passed, and who kept dressing, kept attending, kept performing the same 3 curtsies she had practiced as a girl, because the alternative, stepping outside the only structure she had ever known how to live inside, was not really a structure she had ever been taught to imagine. There is something in that worth sitting with for a moment. Versailles asked an enormous amount of every woman who lived inside it, and it did not particularly care whether she was 19 and newly arrived, or 57 and quietly fading toward the back of the room. The performance did not end simply because a woman grew tired of it, or grew old within it. It only ended in the end when the entire world that required it ended too. It is worth stepping back, just for a moment, and looking at the sheer scale of the machine that made all of this possible, because the numbers, taken together, are almost difficult to hold in your mind at once. At its height, the palace and its grounds employed a household staff numbering in the thousands, somewhere in the range of 4,000 to 5,000 people, directly serving the royal family and the court across every function imaginable, from the most senior ministers and household officers down through cooks, gardeners, seamstresses, candle tenders, laundresses, and the small army of workers required simply to keep the famous fountains running on the days the king wished to see them running, which required advanced planning, because there was never quite enough water pressure to run every fountain in the garden simultaneously, and so a system of runners would signal ahead along the garden paths, so that fountains could be switched on only just before the royal party actually reached them, and switched off again the moment they passed, an entire hidden layer of labor devoted to maintaining the illusion of continuous, effortless abundance that the king experienced as simply how the world worked. The overall cost of maintaining the court, when French finance ministers occasionally attempted to calculate it honestly in the years before the Revolution, ran to a meaningful percentage of the entire national budget, a fact that becomes almost impossible to hold alongside the ordinary hardship of rural France in the same period without feeling the full weight of what was coming. This is not a detail I want to dwell on harshly tonight, because it is not really the purpose of this particular story, but I think it deserves at least this honest mention, because everything we have walked through this evening, the gowns, the diamonds, the fountains timed to a royal footstep, existed within a kingdom where a great many people never came close to touching that kind of wealth in their entire lives, and the gap between those two realities, sitting quietly for decades, would not stay quiet forever. Let me bring you back into smaller, gentler details for a moment, because I think they deserve their place in this story too, and they are honestly some of my favorite parts of researching an evening like this one. The material world of Versailles ran on objects most of us have simply stopped thinking about, small luxuries so specific to their century that encountering them now feels almost like archaeology. The fan, for instance, was not simply a tool against the heat of a crowded room. It was an entire secondary language, painted and folded from ivory or tortoiseshell or carved wood, and a woman skilled in its use could signal availability, disinterest, playful teasing, or firm rejection to a suitor across a crowded ballroom entirely through the angle at which she held it, snapped it open, or touched it briefly to her lips, a code understood by everyone raised inside this world and entirely invisible to anyone outside it. Perfume, too, carried real meaning and real expense, blended by specialist perfumers in Paris using ingredients imported at genuine cost, orange blossom, jasmine, ambergris drawn from the digestive tract of sperm whales and prized specifically for the way it made other, lighter scents last longer on the skin. A woman's chosen scent became, over years of consistent use, something close to a signature, recognizable to those close to her even in a darkened room, and changing one's signature perfume, for reasons of fashion or personal reinvention, was itself a small social event worth noting among friends. And porcelain, delicate and imported at first from China, and later produced domestically at the royal manufactory of Sèvres, not far from Versailles itself, became one of the Queen's own particular passions. Entire dinner services commissioned in soft, specific colours that would come to be named after her, a particular shade of turquoise blue, still occasionally called bleu de la reine by porcelain specialists today, a small linguistic fingerprint she left behind entirely by accident, through nothing more than personal taste exercised often enough and expensively enough that the world simply agreed, eventually, to name a colour after her. Health and illness moved through this glittering world with the same lack of privacy as everything else, and it is worth spending a little time here too, because it softens, in an odd way, the picture of endless glamour we have been building tonight. Medicine in the 1770s and 80s, even at the wealthiest court in Europe, remained crude by any modern standard. Bloodletting was still a standard treatment for a wide range of ailments, performed by physicians who held genuine positions of honour at court, despite methods that, viewed from where we sit now, did more harm than good more often than not. When the king or queen fell ill, and both did, more than once, seriously, the same crowds that gathered to watch a birth or a dinner could gather, in a hushed and anxious register, outside a sick room, waiting for news, because an illness in the royal family was never a private medical matter. It was a matter of state, potentially a matter of succession, and the court's anxiety attached itself accordingly. Smallpox in particular haunted the royal family, with real and justified fear, having taken Louis XVI's own grandfather, Louis XV, in a genuinely horrifying illness in the year 1774, one that left the old king's face and body so disfigured by the disease in his final days that even his closest attendants were reportedly shaken by what they saw, and that death, arriving suddenly and terribly in a body of state that had seemed, for so long, untouchable, cast a long shadow over the earliest years of the new king and queen's reign, a quiet reminder underneath all the silk and diamonds that no rank, no fortune, no palace full of watching eyes could actually purchase safety from the ordinary dangers that shaped every other life in the kingdom too. Marie Antoinette herself was inoculated against smallpox not long after this, using the older, riskier method of variolation rather than the safer vaccination that would only be developed decades later by Edward Jenner in England, a decision that required real courage given the procedure's own mortality risk, undertaken specifically because the alternative, remaining vulnerable to a disease that had just killed the previous king in such a visible and horrifying way, felt like the greater danger. It worked. She survived the inoculation without serious incident, and the moment was treated at court as a genuine, celebrated relief, one of the rare instances where the Queen's personal medical decision became, briefly, a matter of public reassurance rather than public criticism. Winter at Versailles deserves its own brief mention too, because the season changed the texture of daily life in ways that summer visitors to the palace today, walking through sun-warmed gardens, rarely think to imagine. The palace, for all its grandeur, was genuinely difficult to heat. Vast rooms with high ceilings and enormous windows built for light and symmetry rather than warmth, and even the wealthiest women at court, wrapped in fur-lined cloaks and seated as close to a fireplace as etiquette allowed, spoke often in their letters of real, persistent cold through the winter months, ink freezing in inkwells overnight in the less favoured apartments, breath visible in unheated corridors between one grand room and the next. The Queen's own private apartments, given priority for fuel and fires, fared better than most, but even there, the deep cold of a French winter found its way in around windows built more for beauty than for insulation, and the fashionable practice of wearing multiple layers of fine, thin silk, gorgeous as it looked in a portrait, offered remarkably little actual protection against a genuinely cold night. Let us go back into the kitchens for a moment, because we have talked at length about what appeared on the table at the grand couvert, and it seems only fair to spend some time on the enormous, largely invisible operation that put it there. The royal kitchens at Versailles were not a single room but a genuine complex, staffed by a kitchen hierarchy nearly as formal in its own way as the household above it. Master cooks, undercooks, roasting specialists, pastry specialists, a separate staff entirely devoted to sauces, another devoted only to the elaborate sugar sculptures and moulded confections that decorated the most formal tables, spun sugar built into small architectural fantasies, castles and birds and flowers that existed for a single evening's display before being broken apart and eaten or discarded, a formal dinner for the royal family and their table, even setting aside the enormous surplus we discussed earlier that fed the household down the ranks, might involve dozens of separate dishes prepared simultaneously, timed with real precision, so that a roast arrived at exactly the correct moment relative to a soup that had been served 20 minutes earlier. All of it carried the genuinely considerable distance from kitchen to table through corridors designed centuries earlier, without much thought for how far food would eventually need to travel to reach a king who insisted on dining, for ceremonial reasons, in rooms positioned well away from where anything was actually cooked. Food arrived at the table lukewarm more often than any modern diner would tolerate, a fact quietly acknowledged even at the time, and dealt with through sheer abundance and elaborate presentation, rather than through anything so practical as moving the kitchens closer to the table. Ice, in an age before refrigeration, was harvested in winter from frozen ponds and stored through the summer in deep, insulated ice houses dug into the grounds specifically for this purpose, packed in straw to slow the melt, allowing the kitchens to produce iced desserts and chilled drinks even in the height of a French summer, a luxury so far beyond the reach of an ordinary household that the mere existence of a sorbet on a July table was, on its own, a small quiet announcement of exactly how much money stood behind the person eating it. The Queen, for her part, developed her own particular tastes over the years, famously fond of simple foods amid all this elaborate abundance, plain boiled chicken, fresh bread, fruit, a preference for lighter fare that some contemporaries found almost eccentric given the sheer richness available to her at every meal, and I find something quietly human in that too. A woman surrounded by spun sugar castles and dozens of competing dishes, reaching again and again for the plainest thing on the table. At the Petit Trianon, in the private theatre she had built there, the Queen went further still in constructing a life slightly her own, taking to the stage herself in amateur theatrical productions performed for a small, carefully chosen audience of close friends, playing roles in light comic operas and pastoral plays, with a genuine enthusiasm that several attendees described in their letters and memoirs with real warmth. This too became fodder for criticism once word of it spread beyond the small circle who had actually attended. A queen playing at being an actress, playing at being a shepherdess, playing at being anything other than the queen, read by critics outside that small circle as one more sign of a woman who had lost touch with the seriousness her position required. And yet inside that small theatre, for the length of a single evening's performance, she seems, by every account of those actually present, to have been something closer to simply happy, doing something she had chosen entirely for its own sake, in front of an audience she had chosen herself, which was, as we have spent this whole evening discovering, about the rarest thing Versailles had to offer any woman inside it, Queen included. There is one more fashion story I want to tell you before we start easing toward the close of this evening, because it captures, better than almost anything else we have discussed, just how impossible it was for this particular woman to make any choice at all, extravagant or simple, without it becoming a public controversy. In the mid-1780s, around the same period as the Petit Trianon and its little farm village, Marie Antoinette began favouring a new, much simpler style of dress for informal occasions, a loose, light muslin gown gathered at the waist with a sash, worn without the heavy-boned stays and wide panniers that had defined court fashion for the entire preceding century. It was called the chemise à la reine, the Queen's shift dress, and when the fashionable portraitist Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun exhibited a painting of the Queen wearing exactly this simple white muslin gown at the official art exhibition of 1783, the reaction was immediate and, to modern eyes, almost bewildering in its intensity. Critics were scandalized, not because the dress was too extravagant, but because it looked too plain, too much like the simple undergarment its name suggested, too informal and too intimate to be an appropriate way for a Queen of France to be seen in an official portrait at all. There were mutterings that she looked as though she had been painted in her underclothes, but there was a second, more practical layer of outrage underneath the moral one, and this is the part I find genuinely fascinating. The gown was made of light cotton muslin, imported increasingly from India and the Levant, rather than the heavy silk that had for generations been the exclusive fabric of French court fashion, silk that was woven domestically, largely in the great manufacturing city of Lyon, supporting an enormous and politically significant French industry and the thousands of skilled workers whose livelihoods depended on it. A queen photographed, so to speak, in imported cotton rather than French silk was read by the Lyon silk manufacturers and quickly by the wider public as an act of genuine economic betrayal. A queen who was supposed to be the walking advertisement for French luxury goods, instead modelling a foreign fabric that threatened the very industry her wardrobe had always been expected to support. The portrait was withdrawn from exhibition within days and replaced with a more conventional, formally dressed version, and the whole episode became, in its own smaller way, exactly the kind of no-win situation that had shaped this woman's entire adult life. Dress extravagantly, and she was a wasteful queen indifferent to the suffering of ordinary people. Dress simply, and she was undermining French industry and appearing in public in what looked, to critical eyes, uncomfortably close to her own undergarments. There was, by the mid-1780s, very little this particular woman could put on her own body that someone, somewhere, was not prepared to turn into evidence against her. We started this evening by deliberately walking past the Hall of Mirrors, and I think now, this late into the story, is the right moment to finally step inside it, because by now you understand enough about this world to see it properly, rather than simply admire it the way a tourist glancing at a photograph might. The gallery runs the length of the palace's central block, 73 meters of it, lined on one side with 17 enormous arched windows looking out over the gardens, and on the other, facing them, 17 matching arches filled with hundreds of individual mirrors, a genuinely staggering technical achievement for its time, because mirror glass of this size and clarity had until only shortly before the gallery's construction been a closely guarded specialty of Venetian glassmakers, and French finance ministers under Louis XIV had gone to real, deliberate lengths, including quietly luring skilled Venetian craftsmen away from their own government at considerable personal risk to those craftsmen, specifically so that France could produce mirrors of this scale domestically, rather than depend on a foreign monopoly for something the king wanted built into the very walls of his palace. At night, lit by hundreds of candles reflected and multiplied endlessly across all those facing mirrors, the gallery became something genuinely difficult to describe without sounding as though you are exaggerating. Light did not simply illuminate the room, it seemed to fill it entirely, doubling and redoubling itself down the long perspective of the hall until the whole space shimmered and a woman walking through it in full court dress, jewels catching that same multiplied candlelight from every angle at once, was, quite literally, by careful design, walking through the most spectacular stage that European craftsmanship of that century knew how to build. And it was, of course, exactly that, a stage. Every mirror in that gallery existed to reflect a viewer back to themselves and to everyone else in the room simultaneously, which meant that a woman walking its length was never for a single step unobserved, not even by her own reflection, multiplied dozens of times over on either side of her, watching her watch herself being watched. I think that image says something true about this entire evening we have spent together tonight. Even the most beautiful room in the most beautiful palace in Europe was built, at its foundation, around the simple, unshakable fact that a woman of consequence at Versailles was never, not for one single moment of her waking day, entirely alone. I want to give you one final scene from inside this world before we start letting it go, and it takes us back to the private rooms behind the Queen's bedchamber, a small suite of rooms known as the Cabinet Doré, the Golden Cabinet, and a handful of adjoining spaces that very few visitors were ever permitted to enter, because these, more than almost anywhere else in the entire palace, came closest to being genuinely hers. Here there was a library, modest by the standards of some great aristocratic collections, but genuinely well used, its books showing, according to those who catalogued the Queen's possessions later, real signs of actual reading rather than mere decorative display. Novels, plays, works of history, some of the more fashionable philosophical writing of the period that was, at that very moment, quietly reshaping how educated Europeans thought about kingship and rank and the natural rights of ordinary people, an irony that would only become fully visible in hindsight. There was a small writing desk where she answered her more personal correspondence, away from the formal secretarial apparatus that handled matters of state. There was, in later years, a harp, an instrument she took up with real dedication, practicing scales in the relative quiet of these rooms, the way anyone, anywhere might practice an instrument they had genuinely come to love, rather than one chosen for them. It is a small human picture, a woman with a library and a harp and a writing desk, tucked away behind rooms crowded with mirrors and diamonds and the endless watching eyes of an entire court. And I think it is worth holding on to, because it reminds us that everything we have discussed tonight, every gown, every lever, every rigid rule of who touches the shift first, happened to an actual person, not a portrait, not a legend, not a villain or a martyr depending on which century's storytellers you happen to be listening to, a person who liked certain books more than others, who found some music genuinely moving, who by every account of those who actually knew her personally rather than those who only ever encountered her as a rumour or a headline, was warmer, funnier, and considerably more anxious about her own position than the marble-cold image history eventually flattened her into. That world did not last, of course, and I think it deserves at least a gentle acknowledgement before we close, though I do not want to leave you with anything heavy tonight, only true. Within a few years of the scenes we have spent this evening inside, the economic pressures pressing on ordinary French families for a generation, the harvest failures, the war debts, the widening gap between a court that spent what it spent without much thought and a countryside that increasingly could not feed itself, broke into open crisis. In October of 1789, a crowd of Parisian women, market women mostly, angry about the price and scarcity of bread, marched the long distance from Paris to Versailles itself and demanded, successfully, that the royal family return with them to the capital, where they could be seen and watched and controlled in an entirely different way than this palace had ever allowed. The court, as this particular court had always understood itself, essentially ended that day, though the family's fate would take several more difficult years to fully play out. I am not going to walk you through the darker chapters of what came after tonight. This is not the evening for that, and honestly I think this particular story, the one we have spent these last few hours inside, deserves to end here, in the palace in the candlelight, before any of that arrived. What I will say is this: the world we have walked through together tonight, the shift passed hand to hand across a freezing room, the diamonds and the 2 million livre necklace, the public dinners behind a railing, the curtain finally drawn at the end of a long day, existed for less than a single human lifetime in its full extravagant form, a few short decades of a very particular, very specific kind of excess, built on foundations that in hindsight were never going to hold. And yet inside those few decades, real women lived real days, felt real joy and real exhaustion, laughed at real jokes in gilded rooms, and closed their eyes each night behind curtains not so very different, in the end, from the ones around your own bed right now. Before we drift further towards sleep, let me tell you a few more things about this world, small things, the kind that rarely make it into the grand histories but that I think belong in a story like this one, because they round out the picture in ways the gowns and the diamonds alone cannot. The Queen kept animals, and this detail always makes me smile a little, because it is one of the few places in her entire recorded life where the accounts agree, almost unanimously, that she was simply uncomplicatedly happy. She favoured small spaniels and other lapdogs, several of which appear by name in household records and in the letters of those who attended her, and she kept birds as well, and at the Petit Trianon, alongside the working farm animals of the hameau we discussed earlier, she maintained a genuine menagerie of more exotic creatures at various points, including, for a time, at least one small flock of sheep chosen specifically for the softness and unusual colour of their wool, which her shepherdesses, actual hired workers dressed for the part, would tend under her occasional supervision. A dog curled at the foot of a formally dressed woman during an otherwise rigid afternoon of correspondence or needlework is a small, warm image, and I like sitting with it, this one small corner of an intensely regulated life where affection could simply be affection, uncomplicated by rank or performance. She also broke with a long-standing royal tradition in choosing, against considerable initial resistance from more conservative voices at court, to breastfeed her own children herself, rather than handing them immediately and entirely to a wet nurse, the standard practice among royal and aristocratic families for generations, specifically because a queen's time and body were, by tradition, not really considered her own to allocate this way. It was a small act in the scheme of everything we have discussed tonight, and yet it was read, at the time, as a meaningfully personal decision, a woman choosing, in one of the very few areas where she genuinely could choose, to be present with her children in a way tradition had not particularly expected of her. I want to mention something less comfortable too, because I think a fair telling includes it. The cosmetics of this era, the rouge and the powder we discussed earlier in the toilette, were not always as harmless as they looked in a gilded mirror. Some of the whitening powders used to achieve the fashionably pale complexion of the period contained lead, absorbed slowly through the skin over years of daily application, and some historians studying the health complaints and occasional disfigurements described in surviving letters and portraits of court beauties from earlier in the century have connected them, at least plausibly, to exactly this kind of long-term cosmetic exposure. Beauty at Versailles, in other words, sometimes carried a genuine, quiet cost that had nothing to do with livres at all. Mourning, when it came, as it inevitably did in any family across enough decades, carried its own strict and expensive protocol. A woman of rank observing formal mourning for a close relative was required to dress entirely in black for a specified period, weeks or months depending on the closeness of the relationship, in fabrics without shine or ornament, before gradually easing into a period of half mourning, generally marked by muted purples and greys, before finally returning to ordinary court dress. This meant an entirely separate mourning wardrobe, commissioned and maintained specifically for these occasions, sitting largely unused in a woman's closets for years at a time until a death somewhere in her extended family required it again. Another quiet, recurring expense folded into the ordinary cost of simply belonging to this particular world. It is worth pausing briefly on the men of this world too, if only for contrast, because the king's own day, though shaped by many of the same rigid rituals, carried a genuinely different texture underneath it. Louis XVI had his own livre and coucher, his own version of the crowded morning dressing ritual, attended by officers of his household rather than ladies, and his own formal audiences and council meetings that structured the middle of his day. But his particular temperament, by nearly every account, leaned toward the private and the practical rather than the theatrical. He was, famously, a genuinely skilled locksmith as a hobby, spending real, contented hours in a private workshop fitted out for exactly this purpose, working with his hands on actual mechanical locks with a focus that seemed to give him a kind of peace the grand ceremonial rooms downstairs never quite managed to. He hunted often and with real enthusiasm, kept detailed personal journals of his hunting results with the same careful, almost obsessive precision he brought to his locks, and by most descriptions found the endless social performance of the court somewhat wearing, preferring, when he could arrange it, the company of a small circle of trusted advisers and family over the crowded rooms his position otherwise required him to occupy. There is something worth noticing in how a king could, at least occasionally, retreat to a private workshop and simply work with his hands in relative peace, in a way that no woman of comparable rank at that same court, including his own wife, was ever quite permitted to do in an equivalent fashion. The freedoms available at Versailles, even among people standing at the very top of its hierarchy, were not distributed evenly, and I think that detail deserves at least this brief mention before we move on. Let me give you one more composite scene before we settle fully into the close of this evening, because I think it captures something the Queen's own story, grand and dramatic as it is, cannot quite manage on its own. Maybe she is 17, and this is her very first true evening at court, presented only weeks earlier, still learning which door leads where in a palace built to be genuinely, deliberately confusing to anyone who has not spent years memorizing its corridors. She has practiced her 3 curtsies more times than she could count, and executed them on the actual day of her presentation with a trembling steadiness that her mother, watching from the edge of the room, later described in a letter as the proudest moment of her own life. Tonight she stands near the edge of an apartment evening, dressed in a gown that took her family's dressmaker 6 weeks to complete, and that cost, she knows without anyone needing to tell her directly, more than her father's estate typically earned across half a year. She does not yet know most of the names in this room. She recognizes the Queen from a distance, a flash of pale blue silk and diamonds moving through a crowd that parts for her automatically, the way water parts for a boat. She is watching everything, cataloguing it, the way any intelligent newcomer to an unfamiliar system watches and catalogues, trying to learn the unwritten rules fast enough not to embarrass her family in the coming weeks. Someone will approach her within the hour, an older woman, kindly enough, testing her conversation, her manners, her general suitability for whatever small role this court might eventually carve out for her. She does not know yet whether she will come to love this world or simply endure it for the rest of her life, the way so many women in that room, on that particular night, had already quietly decided to do. Small tokens of favour moved constantly through rooms like this one too, and it is worth mentioning them, because they were their own quiet economy, running alongside the larger one of gowns and diamonds. Snuff boxes in particular, small, exquisitely crafted containers for powdered tobacco, enamelled or set with miniature portraits or small gems, were exchanged constantly as gifts, as diplomatic courtesies between visiting ambassadors and French officials, as rewards for a favour granted or a service rendered, and a truly fine snuff box, the kind exchanged between people of real consequence, could itself represent a sum well beyond what most people in the kingdom would ever see in a single year. A tiny object, small enough to close inside one hand, carrying inside it an entire small fortune, the way so much of this particular world managed to compress enormous value into objects that, on the surface, looked almost incidental. Let me tell you about bathing, because it is one of those details that genuinely surprises modern listeners every time, and it connects directly back to all that perfume we discussed earlier. Full immersion bathing, the way we think of it now, a proper bath in a tub of hot water, was relatively rare at Versailles, not because of any particular squalor, but because 18th century medical opinion remained genuinely divided on whether hot water opened the pores of the skin in a way that let dangerous humours and illnesses enter the body more easily. Cleanliness, instead, was maintained largely through the frequent changing of linen, the shift worn against the skin beneath all those layers of stays and silk, changed daily or even more often among women who could afford the laundering it required, along with careful washing of the hands, face, and other exposed areas using basins of water and fine linen cloths, rather than full immersion. This is precisely why perfume mattered as much as it did, and why the specific scents chosen carried real social weight, rather than being a mere accessory. A wealthy woman's perfume was not layered over an already clean, modern-smelling body the way we might think of it today. It was doing real active work, and a woman known for a particularly pleasant, distinctive scent had, in a very real sense, achieved something admired and discussed by her peers. The Queen did, eventually, begin taking actual baths with somewhat more regularity than the older tradition strictly recommended, in a specially built bathroom at the Petit Trianon fitted with genuine plumbing, another small, quiet innovation tucked inside her private retreat, another example of that smaller, more modern life she kept building for herself, one careful piece at a time, away from the older customs of the main palace. I want to give you the sound and light of one final grand spectacle before we close, because Versailles, whatever its cruelties, did also produce moments of genuine, breathtaking beauty, and I think this story deserves to end on one of them, rather than only on numbers and grievances. The department responsible for organizing the court's entertainments was called the Menus Plaisirs, literally the small pleasures, a slightly misleading name, given the genuinely enormous budgets and genuinely enormous spectacles it was responsible for producing. Everything from the elaborate stage sets of the opera house to the fireworks displays that occasionally lit the gardens on the grandest ceremonial evenings. Picture one of these evenings. The formal gardens, already extraordinary by daylight, transformed after dark by thousands of small lamps set along the paths and hung in the trees. The great fountains running at full force, lit from below by hidden torches, so that the falling water itself seemed to glow gold and orange against the darkness. Music drifting from pavilions, set up specifically for the occasion. And then, near the evening's height, fireworks launched from barges on the great canal that stretches out beyond the formal gardens. Bursts of colour and light reflected doubled in the still water below them, visible, on the clearest nights, from villages some distance away, ordinary people who could not walk through the palace gates gathering at a safe distance, simply to watch the light in the sky and wonder, however briefly, what it might be like to live inside a world that could afford to burn that much beauty in a single hour, for no reason beyond the pleasure of it. A woman standing in those gardens on an evening like this one, jewels catching the firelight, the smell of gunpowder and blooming night jasmine mixing in the warm air, might have felt, for just that one suspended hour, something close to what the whole palace had always been trying, however clumsily, however expensively, to manufacture. Not comfort exactly, not even happiness necessarily, something closer to wonder, and wonder, whatever else you want to say about this strange, gilded, exhausting world, was a thing Versailles genuinely, reliably knew how to produce. There is a whole other layer to this story that we have only touched briefly tonight, and it lived not in the gowns or the ballrooms, but in the letters that travelled steadily back and forth between Versailles and Vienna for the entire length of Marie Antoinette's marriage, because her mother, the formidable Empress Maria Theresa, ruler of Austria in her own right and one of the genuinely powerful political minds of the entire century, corresponded with her daughter constantly, and those letters survive, hundreds of them, and reading them now gives you a version of this young woman that the court portraits never could. Maria Theresa's letters were often loving, and often, in the same breath, quite sharply critical, worried openly and repeatedly about her daughter's spending, her friendships, her failure for many years to produce an heir, a matter that carried enormous political weight for the fragile alliance between France and Austria that the marriage itself had been arranged specifically to secure. She employed for years her own personal ambassador at the French court, whose actual, quietly acknowledged job included reporting back to Vienna on the young Dauphine's behavior, her spending, her company, information the Empress used to write increasingly pointed letters of maternal concern across a distance that meant weeks could pass between a warning being written and a response arriving. Imagine that particular pressure layered on top of everything else we have discussed tonight, a mother thousands of miles away, watching your every move through the eyes of a paid observer, writing to tell you, with real love and real exasperation both, that you are being watched, and that the watching matters more than you seem to understand. Marie Antoinette's replies, for their part, show a young woman genuinely trying, across years, to reassure a mother she loved and feared in roughly equal measure, defending her friendships, minimizing her expenses in ways the household accounts do not always support, and slowly, gradually, over the better part of a decade, growing into someone who wrote with more confidence and less anxious deference than the frightened 14-year-old bride who had first crossed the border into France with almost nothing of her old life permitted to cross with her, not even her own clothes, which had been ceremonially exchanged for French garments at a specially constructed pavilion on a small island in the middle of the Rhine, a literal physical ritual of erasing one identity and beginning another, performed before she had even properly arrived in the country she would spend the rest of her life in. I think that image, more than almost any other from this entire evening, tells you where this whole story truly begins. Not with diamonds, not with a public dinner behind a railing, with a 14-year-old girl standing on a small island between two countries, changing out of the only clothes she had ever known into clothes chosen entirely by people she had not yet met, for a life she could not possibly have understood the shape of yet, and stepping across a threshold that would not, in any meaningful sense, ever let her fully go home again. Let me tell you about one more kind of evening, because it returns us to that strange particular openness of Versailles that we discussed earlier with the grand couvert, the sense that this palace, for all its rigid hierarchy, occasionally threw its doors open to the wider world in ways that still surprise people today. The masked ball, held periodically in the state apartments or the opera house, particularly during the winter carnival season leading up to Lent, was for certain occasions genuinely open to members of the public who met a basic standard of dress, a mask, a domino cloak, appropriate manners, regardless of their birth or rank. This meant that on the night of a great masked ball, a Parisian merchant's daughter, properly dressed and properly masked, could dance in the same room, sometimes quite literally beside, the Queen of France herself, neither one entirely certain, in the anonymity the masks provided, exactly who the other truly was. There are accounts, some more reliable than others, of Marie Antoinette specifically enjoying this particular anonymity, the rare, genuine novelty of moving through a crowded room without every single person in it immediately recognizing and cataloguing her presence, of having a conversation, even a brief one, with a stranger who spoke to her as simply another masked guest rather than as the Queen. Given everything we have discussed tonight about the sheer relentless visibility of her ordinary life, I think you can understand why a few hours of genuine anonymity, purchased with nothing more than a mask and a domino cloak, might have felt like an almost unbearable luxury, considerably more precious to her in that specific moment than any diamond in her collection. The King's own grand apartment, running along the opposite wing of the palace from the Queen's, followed its own version of these same rules, a sequence of formal rooms, each named for a different planet and its corresponding classical deity. The Salon d'Apollon, housing the throne itself, the Salon de Mars, once used for more martial ceremonial functions, before later becoming a music room, each space built to a scale and a splendor that modern visitors, walking through them today as a museum, still find genuinely overwhelming, and which the people who actually lived and worked inside them, day after day, year after year, eventually learnt to walk past without a second glance, the way any of us stop truly seeing the walls of a house we have lived in long enough, no matter how remarkable those walls might once have seemed to a first-time visitor standing in the doorway. We are getting close to the end of this story now, and I want to slow down even further, because this is the part of the evening where I think you should let your eyes close if they have not already, and simply let my voice carry the rest of the way. Think back for a moment to where we began tonight, that cold room, the shift passed from hand to hand across a shivering queen who only wanted, in that particular instant, the small ordinary mercy of a warm garment placed over her head without ceremony. We have walked a long way since then, through diamonds and card tables and a 2 million-livre necklace she never even asked for, through a farm village built for pretend simplicity and a masked ball where, for one single night a year, nobody quite knew who anybody else truly was. And underneath all of it, the same quiet thread has run the whole way through, hasn't it? A woman with almost unlimited money and almost no unwatched hours. A world so wealthy it could summon fireworks over a still canal for the simple pleasure of it, and so rigid it could not grant its own queen 5 private minutes to dress herself on a winter morning. I do not think this story is really about villains, and I do not think it is really about victims either. Not entirely. I think it is about a system built up slowly over generations by people who genuinely believed, most of them, that this precise, careful, endlessly watched way of living was simply what greatness required, what stability required, what holding a fragile kingdom together across centuries of war and famine and shifting alliances required. And I think it is about the specific, human cost that system quietly extracted from the women living inside it, a cost measured not only in livres, though in livres too, but in something harder to put a number on, the simple ordinary freedom of choosing, even once, even briefly, exactly how you wanted to spend an unwatched hour of your own single finite life. The seasons kept turning at Versailles, the way seasons turn everywhere, long after any of the women we have met tonight had grown old, or moved on, or, in some cases, met endings history remembers, with considerably more weight than it remembers their mornings. Spring brought the gardens back into bloom after the long grey stretch of a French winter, the fountains running again after months of quiet, the first genuinely warm afternoons drawing the court back out onto the gravel paths for the kind of slow, deliberate promenade we described earlier this evening. Summer brought the heaviest heat, and with it, real discomfort beneath all that silk and all those layers, women fanning themselves through afternoons that the architecture, built for symmetry rather than airflow, did very little to cool. Autumn brought the move to Fontainebleau and the return of the hunt, and winter closed the year the way it always had, cold seeping in around beautiful windows, breath visible in unheated corridors, candlelight multiplying itself endlessly down that long mirrored gallery, warm and golden against the dark outside. Let me leave you with one last small scene, quieter than anything else we have visited tonight, because I think it is the right note to end on. It is very late, past midnight, in one of the smaller private rooms behind the Queen's formal apartments, sometime in the calmer years before the crowd from Paris ever came marching up the long avenue toward the palace gates. The grand couvert is long finished, the cards have been put away, the last of the evening's music has faded from whichever room hosted it that night. A single lady in waiting remains nearby, dozing lightly in a chair positioned just outside the bedchamber, close enough to be summoned, far enough to allow something close to solitude, and in that narrow space, that handful of unwatched hours between one performance and the next, a woman who has spent her entire adult life being dressed by other hands, fed in front of strangers, evaluated on the angle of her wrist during a single dance, sits for a moment with a book she chose herself, in a room lit by a single candle rather than the hundreds that filled the halls only hours earlier, and simply reads, not for anyone, not to be seen doing it well, just because the story in front of her was good, and the hour was quiet, and for these few minutes at least, nobody in the entire world was watching to see what she did next. That is the detail I keep coming back to, out of everything we have discussed tonight. Not the diamonds, not the fountains lit gold against the dark, just a woman, alone at last, reading by a single candle, in the last quiet hour before she too finally let her eyes close. There is one more visit worth mentioning before we close, because it offers a rare outside perspective on this entire world, an outsider's eyes looking in, which is exactly the kind of vantage point we have been trying to build together all evening. In the spring of 1777, Marie Antoinette's own brother, Joseph II, Holy Roman Emperor and ruler in his own right, travelled to France largely incognito under the assumed name Count Falkenstein, specifically to see his sister's life for himself, and by most accounts to have a frank, private conversation with her about the state of her marriage, which after 7 years remained childless, a matter of real and growing political concern back in Vienna. Joseph's letters home from this visit are remarkably candid, written by a man used to the more austere, comparatively businesslike court of Vienna, genuinely startled by what he found at Versailles. He wrote with real concern about the gambling, about what he considered an excessive devotion to fashion and appearance, about a general atmosphere he found frivolous in ways that worried him for his sister's long-term reputation and happiness both. And yet he also wrote with evident affection, describing his sister as fundamentally good-hearted, somewhat thoughtless in the way any young person surrounded by too much flattery and too little honest counsel might become, but not, in his assessment, fundamentally changed at her core from the girl who had left Vienna 7 years earlier. He had, by several accounts, the frank conversation about the marriage that Vienna had sent him to have, a conversation history has never fully recovered the precise details of, but which seems, in the years that followed, to have coincided with a genuine warming and deepening of the royal marriage, and, within a few years, finally, the birth of the children whose crowded, airless arrival we described earlier this evening. I mention Joseph's visit specifically because I think an outsider's honest eyes matter in a story like this one, told so many times since by people who never actually set foot in that palace, and who each in their own century had their own reasons for wanting Marie Antoinette to be either a monster or a martyr, rarely anything more complicated or more human than either. Her own brother, who loved her, who worried about her, who genuinely disapproved of parts of what he saw, still left Versailles in 1777 believing, at the centre of it, in a sister worth the worry, a young woman doing her uncertain, imperfect best inside a system that had given her very little honest guidance and a truly enormous amount of unearned scrutiny. The artisans who supplied all of this, the shoemakers and glove makers and feather workers and embroiderers scattered across Paris and beyond, deserve at least a passing mention too, because their skill is woven into every single detail we have discussed tonight, even though almost none of their individual names survive the way Rose Bertin's or Leonard's eventually did. Somewhere in Paris, a shoemaker spent an entire afternoon fitting a single delicate silk slipper to exactly the shape of one particular woman's foot, a shoe that would be worn once, perhaps twice, before fashion or wear demanded a replacement. Somewhere else, a glove maker worked kid leather thin enough to fold like paper into gloves that would mold themselves, after only a few wearings, to the precise shape of a hand they had been measured against months earlier. This entire world, every gown, every fan, every candle burning in every gilded sconce, rested on the quiet, skilled, largely unrecorded labour of thousands of ordinary craftspeople who would never once themselves walk through the palace gates as anything other than a tradesman delivering goods to a side entrance, and I think they deserve, in this story, at least this one small mention of their own. Before we settle into that final quiet scene, let me give you a few more rooms to walk through, because there is still more of this world worth seeing, and I am in no hurry tonight, and I suspect by now neither are you. The diamonds themselves, before they ever reached a queen's throat or a duchess's ears, passed through the hands of a small, tightly connected circle of court jewellers based largely in Paris, men whose names appear again and again across the household accounts of the great families of this era. The firm of Baumer and Bassigny, the very jewellers who had originally commissioned that ill-fated 2 million livres necklace years before the scandal that would eventually attach itself to the Queen's name, supplied a considerable share of the finest stones that moved through Versailles across this entire period, sourcing diamonds from Brazil and from India, cut and set by specialist craftsmen whose skill in coaxing maximum brilliance out of a rough stone was itself a closely guarded trade, passed down through apprenticeships that could last the better part of a decade before a young jeweller was trusted with a stone of any real value. A woman purchasing, or more often receiving as a gift, a significant piece of jewellery from a house like this one was not simply buying a beautiful object, She was buying into a network of relationships, credit, and reputation that stretched from the mining operations of another continent through the cutting houses of Amsterdam and Antwerp, and finally into a small, elegant shop on a Parisian street where a discreet jeweler would present his finest pieces to clients whose custom he had spent years, sometimes generations, cultivating. Debts to jewelers, in fact, were a genuine and recurring feature of aristocratic financial life at this court. Court jewelers, often extending considerable credit to families of unimpeachable rank, but sometimes rather less impeachable liquidity, a quiet financial undercurrent running beneath all that visible sparkle that most portraits, understandably, never think to depict. Festivals and name days punctuated the court calendar too, each with its own small set of expected gifts and gestures. The feast day of St. Louis, honouring the king's own patron saint, fell each August and was marked with particular ceremony, gifts exchanged among the royal family and close household, special masses, and often a notable evening of entertainment. Birthdays, too, though celebrated with less of the elaborate public ritual a modern reader might expect, still called for the careful exchange of appropriate gifts among family and close friends. A fan here, a small jewelled box there, a length of particularly fine lace chosen with real thought for the recipient's taste. Each gift itself another small data point in the constant, quiet social accounting that ran underneath every relationship at Versailles. Intellectual life found its own place inside this world too, more than the popular image of endless frivolity usually allows for. Several of the noble women at court maintained genuine salons, gatherings in their private apartments where philosophers, writers, and the more thoughtful courtiers might discuss the ideas circulating through Enlightenment-era France, ideas about reason and natural rights and the proper structure of government that were, even as these women discussed them over tea and biscuits in gilded rooms, quietly working to undermine the entire system of inherited privilege that had built those very rooms in the first place. The irony was not entirely lost on the more perceptive women involved, several of whom left behind letters and private writings that show a genuine awareness of the strange, uneasy position they occupied, beneficiaries of a system they had, in their private reading and conversation, begun to seriously question. Religious devotion, too, ran genuinely deep for many of these women, whatever the more cynical popular image of the court suggests. Daily mass was not for many mere performance, and several of the wealthiest women at Versailles maintained real, private charitable commitments alongside their public obligations, funding orphanages, contributing to hospitals, occasionally, quietly, without much public announcement, taking a personal interest in the welfare of a specific family or a specific child in genuine need, a side of aristocratic life that rarely made it into the pamphlets and gossip that history has tended to remember most vividly. Marie Antoinette herself, despite her reputation, contributed to charitable causes across her years at Versailles, and is recorded, on several occasions, personally arranging support for individual families who had suffered some particular hardship that had come to her attention. A quieter, less remarked-upon thread running alongside all the extravagance we have spent this evening discussing. Simply moving through the palace in full court dress was its own small daily challenge, and I think it deserves a moment of attention, because we have talked so much about what women wore, and so little about what it actually meant to walk anywhere in it. The wide panniers we discussed earlier, holding formal skirts out several feet on either side, meant that doorways, corridors, and staircases throughout Versailles had to be managed with real, practiced skill. A woman in full formal dress approaching an ordinary doorway would turn her body sideways, angling the wide frame of her skirts through the opening in a single smooth motion that, done correctly, looked almost effortless, and done incorrectly could mean an embarrassing moment of skirts catching on a doorframe in front of an entire room of watching courtiers. Staircases were worse still, and the grandest of them at Versailles, the ones built specifically for ceremonial use, were designed with unusually shallow, wide steps in part specifically to accommodate the sheer physical scale of formal court dress moving up and down them without incident. Carriages, too, required their own particular choreography. A woman arriving for an evening at court in full formal dress could not simply climb into an ordinary carriage the way a modern person steps into a car. The panniers had to be carefully managed sometimes tilted or gently compressed as she entered, sometimes requiring the assistance of an attendant specifically to help fold the wide skirts inward enough to clear the carriage door, and grand formal court gowns, the very widest ones reserved for the most significant occasions, sometimes could not be worn inside an ordinary carriage at all, requiring the woman to travel in a simpler dress and change only upon arrival, in a room set aside for exactly this purpose near the entrance to the state apartments. Let me give you one more small family scene before we finally truly settle towards sleep, because I think it earns its place here too. Maybe she is a mother now, this woman we have been following in various guises all evening, some years into her time at court, with a daughter of her own just beginning the long process of preparation for a life inside this same glittering, exhausting system. She watches her daughter practice a curtsy in the mirror of their private apartment, watches the careful, deliberate correction of a dancing master brought in specifically for this purpose, watches her own younger self, in a sense, being slowly assembled out of a girl who, only a few years earlier, cared about nothing more complicated than a favorite doll and an afternoon spent outdoors. She feels, watching this, something genuinely complicated, a pride that is real and unforced, sitting right alongside a quieter, less comfortable feeling she does not entirely allow herself to examine too closely. The sense of watching a door close slowly on her daughter, the same way it once closed, slowly, almost imperceptibly, on her. She does not stop the lessons. She could not, even if she wanted to, not without ending any hope of a secure and comfortable future for this particular daughter in this particular world. But there is a moment, just one, late one afternoon, watching her daughter's small determined face concentrating on the exact angle of a curtsy in front of the mirror, when she reaches out, unnecessarily, and smooths a strand of hair that did not actually need smoothing, simply for the excuse of touching her daughter's head for a moment longer than the lesson strictly required. Music deserves one more mention before we close, because it connects the young girl who left Vienna to the woman she eventually became more directly than almost anything else in this story. As a child in Austria, Marie Antoinette had been taught music by, among others, a composer named Christoph Willibald Gluck, and when Gluck later arrived in Paris seeking to stage his reformist operas, works that broke from the ornate, showy conventions of French opera at the time in favor of something starker and more emotionally direct, it was the Queen's own patronage, her genuine, remembered fondness for her old teacher, that helped secure him a hearing at the Paris Opera, and eventually, real and lasting success in France. The premiere of his opera Iphigenie en Aulide in 1774 was attended by the Queen with evident enthusiasm, and the ongoing rivalry that developed in Parisian musical circles between supporters of Gluck's new reformist style and supporters of the older, more traditional Italian-influenced composer Niccolò Piccini became for a few genuinely entertaining years one of the great cultural arguments of the age, with the Queen's own preferences quietly shaping which side of that argument carried more weight at court. I find something worth sitting with in that small thread too. A woman who could not choose her own husband, could not choose the country she would live in, could barely choose the placement of a chair in her own private theatre, nonetheless using the specific, narrow power she did hold to open a door for the teacher who had once, patiently, taught a small Austrian archduchess to sing. Even speech itself, at Versailles, followed rules precise enough to require real training. One did not simply address the king or queen directly using an ordinary form of speech. Formal address required specific constructions, Votre Majesté for the king and queen themselves, particular honorifics for princes and princesses of the blood, an entire graduated vocabulary of respect that shifted depending on exactly how closely related to the throne the person being addressed happened to be. Speaking out of turn, addressing someone above your own rank too familiarly, or conversely showing excessive, almost servile deference to someone whose rank did not actually warrant it, were both, in their own ways, social errors that a sharp-eyed courtier would notice and quietly remember. A woman newly arrived at court could commit no error more embarrassing, in those first anxious weeks, than simply not yet knowing precisely how she was supposed to address the person standing directly in front of her. Behind every one of these evenings of music and spectacle stood an army of specialized craftspeople whose work we have not yet properly acknowledged tonight, the scene painters and machinists of the menus plaiseurs who built and rebuilt entire stage worlds inside the opera house with a speed and technical sophistication that genuinely impressed visiting foreign dignitaries used to considerably less ambitious court entertainments back home. A single opera production might require entirely painted backdrops depicting distant temples or storm-tossed seas, machinery hidden beneath the stage capable of raising and lowering entire set pieces during a performance, and costume workshops working for weeks in advance to outfit a full cast and chorus in garments as carefully considered, in their own way, as anything a noblewoman wore to the grand couvert. These workers rarely appear in any account of Versailles that focuses only on the nobility, and yet without them, none of the evenings we have described tonight, the fireworks over the canal, the raised floor of the opera house transforming itself into a ballroom, the masked ball where a merchant's daughter might dance beside a queen, would have been remotely possible. I think, sitting here so many years later, what stays with me most about this entire story is not any single gown or any single diamond, though we have spent plenty of time on both tonight. It is the sheer, accumulated weight of all those small rules, stacked one on top of another for generations, until an entire world of genuinely brilliant, genuinely capable people, women who could read a room in a single glance, manage complex households, make their way through treacherous political currents with real skill, spent the whole of their days moving inside a structure built long before they were born, one that told them, in exhausting, granular detail, exactly how to dress, exactly how to eat, exactly how to speak, and left surprisingly little space, in the end, for them to simply exist. And yet they did exist, fully, vividly, with real friendships and real grief, and real small private joys, tucked into whatever corners the system allowed for. A game of cards that ran too late, a dog curled at the foot of a chair, a single candle burning low over a book chosen for no reason beyond genuine pleasure. That, I think, is the whole of what I wanted to leave you with tonight. Not simply the extravagance, remarkable as it was, but the human beings who lived inside it, finding, against every architectural and social obstacle this palace could put in front of them, small, real moments of their own. Today, if you were to walk through Versailles yourself, during ordinary daylight hours, surrounded by other visitors and audio guides and the general bright, practical bustle of a major modern museum, you would see the Hall of Mirrors emptied of nearly everything we discussed tonight. No candles multiplying their light endlessly across all those panels, no silk rustling underfoot, no careful hierarchy of who enters a doorway first. The furniture in the Queen's private apartments has been painstakingly restored, piece by piece, over decades, by historians and conservators working from old inventories and surviving fragments, trying to recreate, as closely as the evidence allows, exactly what these rooms looked like on an ordinary evening in the 1770s or 80s. Visitors move through in comfortable modern shoes, in trousers and sneakers and whatever else they happen to wear that morning, entirely unaware, most of them, of the exact weight of what a woman would once have worn simply to stand in that same spot. Something of it remains, even now, if you know to look for it, and I think that is worth carrying with you as we finally close this evening together. The gardens still bloom in roughly the pattern Le Nôtre originally laid out for Louis XIV, over 3 centuries ago now. The fountains still run, on certain scheduled days, drawing crowds who gather to watch water catch the light exactly the way it once did for an entirely different audience, dressed entirely differently, worrying about entirely different things. The mirrors still hang in their original arched frames, and if you stand in the right spot at the right hour of a bright afternoon, they still do exactly what they were built to do, catch the light streaming through those 17 tall windows, and multiply it endlessly down the length of the gallery, the same trick of glass and silver that once dazzled ambassadors and courtiers, and one particular 14-year-old girl who had crossed an entire continent to reach this room, and who could not, on that first overwhelming day, have possibly imagined everything that room would eventually ask of her, or everything she would eventually, quietly, in her own small private ways, manage to hold on to anyway. Let me give you just a little more before we finally let the story rest, because there is a particular hour of the Versailles day we have not yet fully sat inside together, the long golden stretch of late afternoon in early autumn when the light through those tall garden-facing windows turns low and amber and the whole palace, for an hour or two, seems to soften slightly around its own hard edges. At this hour, a woman who had survived the toilette and the grand couvert and whatever formal audience the day required might find herself briefly in something closer to unstructured time than any other point in her schedule, waiting for the evening's entertainments to properly begin. And it is in exactly this kind of golden, in-between hour that so many of the smaller, less recorded pleasures of Versailles actually happened. A quiet conversation with a genuine friend rather than a calculated social exchange. A few pages of a novel read simply because the light was good and the room was warm. A letter to a sister or a cousin written slowly without the pressure of formal correspondence, full of small ordinary news that would mean nothing to history and everything to the two people exchanging it. The gardens at this hour emptied of their earlier crowds, the most dedicated promenaders having already completed their rounds and retired to dress for the evening, leaving behind long empty avenues of clipped trees casting longer and longer shadows across the gravel, fountains running quietly to almost nobody, the whole vast, expensive machine of the place humming along on its own momentum with, for once, very few people actually watching it do so. A woman who wandered out here alone, or with only a single trusted companion, in this specific quiet hour, was doing something close to what any of us do when we step outside for a few minutes of air between one obligation and the next, seeking nothing more complicated than a little space, a little quiet, a little room to simply be a person rather than a performance. I like to imagine her there, whoever she was on any given afternoon across all those years, pausing near one of the great stone basins, watching the surface of the water catch the low autumn light, feeling the particular, specific relief of an hour with nothing yet required of her, before the candles were lit and the doors opened, and the whole beautiful, exhausting evening began again exactly as it had the night before, and would again tomorrow, and would again the night after that, for as long as this particular world continued to exist at all. One final small detail before we let this golden hour close, because it has stayed with me since I first came across it. Among the Queen's personal effects catalogued after her household eventually dispersed were a number of quite ordinary things, tucked in among the diamonds and the porcelain and the elaborate court gowns, small personal items of the kind any woman anywhere might keep close by. A well-worn prayer book, a handful of letters kept not for their political importance, but simply, it seems, because she wanted to keep them, a child's small drawing, carefully preserved. It is easy, across this much distance and this many retellings, to lose the woman entirely inside the legend, to see only the extravagance and the scandal and the eventual well-known ending, and to forget that underneath all of it was someone who kept a child's drawing, the way any mother anywhere might, simply because it mattered to her, entirely apart from anything the rest of the world would ever think to notice or record. We have spent nearly this entire evening following the Queen herself, and I think that is fair, given how thoroughly her story has come to stand in for this whole world in the popular imagination. But I want to widen the frame just slightly before we close, because Versailles was never home to only one wealthy woman, and some of the others deserve at least a passing mention tonight. The King's own aunts, daughters of the earlier Louis XV, were known collectively at court as mesdames, and individually as Madame Adélaïde, Madame Victoire, and Madame Sophie, unmarried women who had spent their entire lives inside the rigid structure of Versailles without ever leaving it for a household of their own, the way marriage would ordinarily have provided. They occupied a curious position, women of the very highest rank, wealthy beyond almost any measure, and yet somewhat sidelined from the centre of court life once their own father died and a new king and queen took the central stage, watching from a kind of respected, well-appointed distance as the world they had grown up at the absolute heart of slowly reorganized itself around younger women they did not always feel much warmth toward. Madame Adélaïde in particular developed a reputation, by several contemporary accounts, for a certain sharp, occasionally difficult temperament, not entirely surprising in a woman who had spent decades near the absolute centre of French power, only to watch a foreign-born teenager arrive and, seemingly overnight, become the most closely watched woman in the entire kingdom. There are records of real friction between the aunts and the young queen in those early years, disagreements over precedence, over influence, over the countless small daily questions of who deferred to whom in a household this large and this status-conscious, friction that softened somewhat over the years but never entirely disappeared. It is a useful reminder, I think, that Versailles was never simply one woman's story, however much any single telling, including this one tonight, inevitably narrows its focus for the sake of a clear narrative thread. The king's younger sister, Madame Elizabeth, offers a rather different picture again, a woman known across her life for genuine, unshowy piety and real personal devotion to her family, who remained close to her brother and sister-in-law through the more difficult years that eventually followed, choosing, when she had opportunities to secure her own safety separately, to stay near them instead. Her wardrobe accounts and personal habits, by the surviving evidence, ran notably simpler than many of her wealthy peers at court, less devoted to the elaborate fashion competition that consumed so many of the women around her, more devoted to quiet charitable work and to a small circle of trusted friends, a genuinely different way of inhabiting the same extraordinary wealth and the same rigid system, proof, if any more were needed, that even inside a world this uniform in its outward rules, real individual temperament still found room to express itself in the choices a woman made with whatever narrow freedoms she actually had. There is a darker thread running underneath everything we have discussed tonight that deserves at least an honest mention before we close, because it shaped the Queen's life and eventually her fate as much as any gown or any diamond ever did. Throughout the 1770s and 80s, an entire underground industry of printed pamphlets, known as libelles, circulated through Paris and beyond, many of them viciously personal, accusing the Queen of extravagances real and wildly invented in equal measure, of affairs she never had, of scandals fabricated wholesale by writers who understood, correctly, that stories about a foreign-born queen's supposed excess and immorality sold extremely well to a public already primed by real economic hardship to believe the worst about the people living in gilded rooms while ordinary bread prices climbed. These pamphlets, illegal and officially suppressed, circulated anyway, passed hand to hand, read aloud in taverns and print shops, shaping public opinion in ways the Queen herself had almost no ability to counter, because dignity and the strict etiquette that governed how a Queen of France was permitted to respond to public criticism offered her essentially no acceptable way to publicly defend herself against accusations she could not even openly acknowledge existed. She could not write a rebuttal. She could not grant an interview correcting the record. The entire apparatus of image and reputation that a modern public figure might use to answer false accusations simply did not exist for a woman in her position, and so the libelles accumulated, year after year, largely unanswered, building a public image of extravagance and moral looseness that had, by the time of the actual revolution, become so thoroughly embedded in the popular imagination that even her genuine innocence in matters like the diamond necklace affair barely registered against it. I think this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it connects so directly to everything else we have discussed tonight about visibility and privacy and the total absence of any truly unwatched hour in this woman's life. Even her reputation, the one thing a person might hope to have some real say over, was not, in any meaningful sense, hers to control. It belonged to pamphleteers she never met, printing stories in secret print shops about a woman most of them had never once seen in person, building, sheet by illegal sheet, an entirely fictional version of her that would, in the end, prove considerably more durable and more consequential than anything she actually did. Not every hour of leisure at Versailles revolved around cards, and I want to mention a few of the other quieter amusements that filled the gaps between the grander ceremonies, because they give a slightly different texture to the picture we have been building tonight. Billiards was a genuine favourite among both men and women of the court, played on tables built and maintained specifically for the palace, the quiet click of ivory balls against green baize providing a rather more relaxed backdrop to conversation than the tense, high-stakes atmosphere of a serious card table. Blind man's bluff and other simple parlour games involving forfeits and gentle flirtatious teasing appear regularly in accounts of smaller, more informal evenings, particularly at the Petit Trianon, where the Queen's own preference for a lighter, less ceremonial atmosphere among close friends found room to actually breathe. Charades in an early form and various guessing games built around riddles and wordplay filled other evenings, requiring nothing more than wit and good company, genuinely democratic amusements in a world that otherwise measured almost everything by rank. The silk that clothed this entire world deserves one final closer look too, because we have mentioned it constantly tonight without ever quite pausing on how it was actually made. Lyon, the great silk-weaving city of France, employed tens of thousands of workers across an entire specialized industry, from the growers who cultivated mulberry trees to feed silkworms, through the spinners and dyers, to the master weavers who operated the enormous drawer looms capable of producing the kind of complex, patterned brocade favored for the grandest court gowns, fabric where a single repeating floral motif might require a skilled weaver's close attention for weeks to complete even a modest length. These patterns shifted with real speed by the standards of the time, new designs commissioned each season by fashionable dressmakers eager to offer their noble clients something nobody else at court had yet worn, a version of fashion's endless churn that would feel, in its basic logic, entirely recognizable to anyone familiar with how clothing trends move today, if considerably slower and considerably more expensive at every single step. A length of the finest Lyon silk, densely patterned and shot through with metallic thread, could cost as much per yard as a skilled worker earned in a week, and a single formal gown might require a dozen yards or more before the dressmaker's own considerable labor was even added to the total. It is worth remembering, as we finally start letting this whole glittering world settle into stillness for the night, that every single one of those yards passed through dozens of human hands before it ever touched a noblewoman's skin, each hand belonging to a real person with their own ordinary life, their own ordinary hopes, largely invisible to the very people whose bodies their labor eventually clothed. Let me take you back, briefly, to the very beginning of this particular queen's life at Versailles, to the wedding itself in May of 1770, because it set the pattern for nearly everything that followed, and I think it deserves its proper place in tonight's story, before we finally let the whole evening rest. The ceremony took place in the palace's own chapel, before a congregation of the entire assembled court, the bride not yet 15 years old, married to a dauphin she had met for the first time only days earlier, the whole event conducted with a formality and a scale that dwarfed almost any wedding most of us could easily imagine. Thousands of livres spent on decoration and ceremony alone, before a single course of the wedding banquet had even been served. The banquet that followed was, itself, staged as a form of public theatre, the newly married couple seated at a table specifically positioned so that the assembled crowd of courtiers and invited guests could watch them eat their very first meal as husband and wife, continuing that same relentless visibility we have discussed all evening from literally the opening hours of the marriage itself. Fireworks were planned for that first evening too, an enormous display intended to celebrate the union and by extension the renewed alliance between France and Austria that the marriage had been arranged to secure. Though a sudden storm rolled in and forced much of the display to be postponed, a small, almost symbolic disappointment, tucked into the very beginning of a story that would, in its own way, keep encountering storms of one kind or another for the rest of its length. There was also, tragically, a genuine disaster connected to the wedding celebrations when a public fireworks display held some days later in Paris itself, intended for the ordinary citizens of the city rather than the court, went wrong amid overcrowded streets, resulting in a stampede that killed a considerable number of Parisians, a grim, largely forgotten footnote to the celebrations, and one that in hindsight, historians have sometimes read as an early unheeded warning of exactly how dangerous a large, poorly managed crowd gathered around royal spectacle could actually become. The young bride herself, in the earliest days of that marriage, wrote home to her mother with the careful, dutiful cheerfulness expected of a 14-year-old, suddenly thrust into the center of the largest, most scrutinized court in Europe, describing the kindness of her new husband's family, the beauty of the palace, the warmth of her welcome, letters that read, when you know everything that eventually followed, with a particular kind of tenderness, a young girl doing exactly what young girls in difficult new situations have always done, putting on a brave, hopeful face for the people back home who loved her and could not actually help her from so very far away. And so we return, finally, full circle, to where this whole evening actually began, that first cold morning, The shift passed hand to hand across a shivering room, because I think you understand now, in a way you perhaps did not at the very start of tonight's story, exactly how directly that single small moment of discomfort connects to everything else we have walked through together. The 14-year-old girl writing hopeful letters home, the 19-year-old dancing her very first minuet under hundreds of watching eyes, the young mother watching her own daughter practice a curtsy in a mirror, the woman reading quietly by a single candle in the last private hour of a long, exhausting day. All of it the same woman, at different hours of different years, inside the same vast, glittering, unyielding system, and all of it in its own way, a version of that same freezing morning, waiting patiently for someone else's hands to decide what happened to her next. There is a small, particular economy running underneath all those candles we have mentioned so often tonight that deserves its own moment, because it connects the grandest rooms of the palace to the servants' quarters in a way that genuinely surprised me the first time I came across it. Candles at Versailles, once lit even briefly for an evening ceremony, were rarely simply left to burn down to nothing and discarded. By long-standing custom, partially burned candles from the state apartments became a recognized perquisite, a kind of unofficial wage supplement, claimed by specific household officers whose position entitled them to gather and either use or resell the leftover wax each night. A steward or a senior valet, with the right claim on this particular privilege, could, over the course of a year, turn half-burned beeswax candles into a genuinely meaningful supplement to an otherwise modest salary, and disputes over exactly who held the right to which room's leftover candles were, by several surviving household records, taken remarkably seriously by the people involved, a small, almost invisible economy of wax and privilege running quietly underneath every grand evening we have described tonight. The physical journey into the palace itself, before a guest ever reached any of the rooms we have spent this evening inside, deserves a mention too, because Versailles was built to impress a visitor before they had even properly arrived. The Escalier des Ambassadeurs, the ambassador's staircase, completed under Louis XIV decades before Marie Antoinette's arrival, was one of the true architectural marvels of the entire complex. A vast marble staircase rising through a soaring, light-filled space decorated with painted panels depicting France's greatest allies and trading partners from around the known world, designed specifically so that a foreign ambassador, climbing toward an audience with the king, would arrive already thoroughly, deliberately overwhelmed. The staircase was demolished later in the 18th century to make room for other apartments, a loss architectural historians still describe with genuine regret, but during the years we have spent tonight walking through, it stood as one of the first true statements the palace made to any newcomer, a message delivered entirely through marble and painted ceiling before a single word of formal greeting had even been exchanged. A formal reception of a visiting foreign dignitary, arriving by that staircase or one of the grand entrances that replaced it, followed its own precise choreography too, distinct from the daily rhythms we have spent most of tonight inside. Weeks of preparation might precede a single afternoon's audience, household officers coordinating with the visiting party's own staff over exact questions of protocol, which door the visitor would enter through, how many steps into the room the king would advance to greet them, whether the visitor's own rank entitled them to a formal embrace or only a bow, each tiny detail negotiated in advance with a seriousness that, from the outside, might look almost comic, and that, from the inside, genuinely could determine the success or failure of delicate diplomatic relationships between entire nations. Rose Bertin's own rise deserves one further detail, because it connects to something genuinely significant in the history of women's work that rarely gets its due. For centuries, the tailoring of women's formal garments in France had been legally restricted to male tailors, organized into their own powerful guild, until 1816-75, when, after considerable petitioning, French women finally won the right to form their own official guild of seamstresses and dressmakers, the Corporation des Couturières, allowing women for the first time to legally construct and sell the elaborate gowns that other women would wear. By the time Rose Bertin rose to prominence a century later, this guild had become a genuine, established institution, and her own success, remarkable even within it, opened real professional doors for the women who trained under her and later established their own workshops. a quiet thread of female economic independence running underneath all that silk and spent livres we have discussed so much tonight, easy to miss entirely if you only look at the finished gowns and never think to ask who, specifically, had actually built them. The chocolate that so often opened the Queen's morning, that thick, sweetened cup we mentioned earlier tonight, carried its own long trade history worth a brief mention too. Cacao had arrived in France by way of Spain, where it had first been introduced from the Spanish colonies in the Americas over a century earlier, and by the time it reached a royal breakfast tray at Versailles, it had been processed, sweetened, and flavored according to recipes that court chocolatiers guarded with real professional pride, sometimes adding vanilla, sometimes a touch of cinnamon or orange flower water, each household, or even each individual within it, developing particular preferences that their personal chocolatier learnt to prepare exactly to taste. A specific court position, chocolatier de la reine, existed specifically to manage this single narrow task, preparing the Queen's chocolate to her exact specifications each morning, one more small, dedicated role tucked inside a household that employed specialists for tasks a modern household would consider almost absurdly minor. Let me give you one quieter family scene before we finally settle towards sleep, because we have spent so much of tonight on ceremony and expense that I want to leave a little more room for the ordinary tenderness that existed alongside it. In the nursery wing of the palace, removed from the grand ceremonial rooms by several corridors and a very different atmosphere entirely, the royal children spent their early years under the care of a governess and a small staff dedicated entirely to their well-being, a world of wooden toys and simple meals and early lessons that, for all its own eventual formality as the children grew older, offered a genuinely gentler rhythm than anything we have described in the state apartments tonight. Marie Antoinette, by the accounts of those who observed her with her children, was a warm and genuinely present mother when her schedule allowed it, visiting the nursery regularly, involving herself personally in decisions about her children's education and care in a way that was, again, something of a departure from the more distant, formally structured parenting expected of royal mothers in earlier generations. The loss of her eldest son to illness in the childhood years that followed the period we have mostly discussed tonight was, by every surviving account, a grief that marked her permanently, a private sorrow that no amount of wealth or ceremony could soften, sitting quietly underneath the public image of extravagance that history has so often chosen to remember instead. Sitting for a formal portrait was its own particular kind of labor, and I think it deserves a mention, because we have spoken so much tonight about the finished image of these women, the paintings that survive in museums now, without ever discussing what actually producing one of those paintings required of the woman inside it. Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, the portraitist responsible for so many of the images we now associate most strongly with Marie Antoinette, would typically require multiple separate sittings to complete a single formal portrait, the subject holding a specific pose, in full formal dress, for hours at a stretch, across several different days, while the painter worked slowly through the layers of underpainting and detail that a truly fine portrait of this era demanded. Vigée-Lebrun herself, in her later memoirs, described the Queen as a remarkably patient and genuinely pleasant sitter, someone who put her at ease despite the enormous difference in their respective ranks, chatting easily during the long, physically uncomfortable hours a formal pose required, occasionally even singing quietly to pass the time while the artist worked at her easel nearby. I find something worth noticing in that detail too. Even the images we now take as the definitive visual record of this entire world, the paintings hanging in galleries, reproduced in textbooks, printed on the very thumbnails that might have brought you to a story like this one tonight, were themselves the product of real, sustained physical labor and real, ordinary human interaction between two women who, by several accounts, genuinely came to like each other across the many hours those sittings required. Rainy afternoons at Versailles, when the gardens turned to mud and the planned promenade or hunt had to be abandoned entirely, called for their own particular set of indoor amusements, and I want to give you one such afternoon before we finally close this evening together. On a day like this, the state apartments filled earlier than usual, with courtiers seeking shelter from the weather and something to occupy the unexpectedly long indoor hours, card tables set up in greater number than a clear day might have required, conversation turning, as it always eventually did in a room full of bored, elegant people, to gossip, to speculation about upcoming appointments and marriages, to the gentle, ongoing theatre of who was in favour this particular week and who was not. The card game most associated with these long indoor afternoons, Landsquent, worked on a deceptively simple set of rules, cards dealt and matched against a banker's hand, the banker changing periodically as fortunes shifted around the table, stakes rising and falling with the particular mood of whichever group happened to be seated together that day. It required almost no strategic skill, which was, in its own way, exactly the point. A game built purely on chance let rank and reputation and years of careful social manoeuvring fall away for the length of a single hand, everyone at the table equally at the mercy of whichever card turned up next. A rare kind of levelling that this particular world, so obsessed with hierarchy in every other single respect, otherwise almost never allowed itself. Fine linen and all the shifts changed daily beneath every silk gown we have described tonight, required their own considerable operation too, largely invisible to anyone above a certain rank at court. Fine linen required careful, specialized washing, done by laundresses working with soap made from ash and rendered fat, boiling water heated over wood fires, and considerable physical labor to scrub, rinse, wring, and finally lay out or hang each piece to dry, work that fell disproportionately to women of the lowest paid ranks within the household, their days shaped by an entirely different rhythm than anything we have discussed so far tonight, beginning before dawn and continuing through hours of genuinely exhausting physical labor that no portrait of this era ever thought to depict. The finest linen, embroidered with a family's monogram in fine thread, was laundered separately and with particular care, starched to a precise, fashionable stiffness using a paste made from wheat or rice, and pressed using heavy heated irons that required their own careful handling to avoid scorching fabric that had, in some cases, taken a needleworker weeks to embroider in the first place. I mention this specifically because it belongs, I think, in any honest telling of this world, the same way the shift passed hand to hand across a freezing room belonged in the very opening minutes of tonight's story. Every single beautiful object we have discussed this evening, every gown and every fan and every perfectly starched piece of fine linen, rested on a foundation of ordinary, unglamorous, genuinely difficult labor performed by people whose names essentially none of us will ever know, and I think a story about wealth is only really complete once it makes at least a little room for the people whose work made that wealth visible in the first place. Let me bring you back, one final time, to the woman herself, because I think that is where this evening rightly belongs before we finally let it rest. Whichever version of her you have been picturing tonight, the frightened bride on the little island in the Rhine, the young mother watching her daughter practice a curtsy, the woman quietly reading by a single candle in the last private hour of a long day, she was, underneath every single ritual and every single lever we have discussed, simply a person, doing her uncertain best inside a world she had not built and could not, in any meaningful sense, ever fully leave. That, more than the diamonds, more than the 2 million livre necklace, more than the fireworks over the still canal, is the detail I most want you to carry with you as you finally let your own eyes close tonight. There is one last small ritual worth mentioning before we close, because it sits at the very boundary between the public performance we have spent this whole evening inside and the genuine privacy so rarely available to any of these women. Each night, after the formal coucher had concluded and the attending household had largely withdrawn, a single trusted servant, often the most senior of the femmes de chambre, remained close by through the night, sleeping lightly in an adjoining room, ready to be summoned by the smallest sound or the gentlest pull of a bell cord, positioned within easy reach of the bed. This was not, strictly speaking, true solitude, not in the way we might understand the word now, and yet it came, within the specific grammar of this particular world, about as close to it as any arrangement Versailles had ever developed. A woman lying awake in the deep hours of the night, unable to sleep, turning over some worry from the day, a dressmaker's bill, a friend's cooling favour, a letter from a mother thousands of miles away, faced that private hour largely alone with her own thoughts, the watching eyes of the entire court finally, genuinely absent, if only until the shutters opened again, and the whole extraordinary performance began once more. I think it is worth remembering, as we finally let this particular evening close, that this same quiet hour, this same private darkness, exists for you right now too, in whatever room you are actually lying in, wherever this story found you tonight. No curtsy required, no correct order of hands, just the dark and the quiet, and whatever thoughts are gently, slowly loosening their grip as sleep finally arrives. Somewhere in the household accounts that survive from this era, tucked in among the enormous sums spent on silk and diamonds and 200 candles for a single evening's ball, are also the small, unremarkable entries. A few livres here for mending a torn hem, a modest sum there for replacing a worn-out pair of gloves, ordinary maintenance folded in among the extraordinary extravagance, easy to overlook entirely if you are only looking for the dramatic figures. I find something quietly grounding in those small entries, proof that even inside a household spending sums that would have supported entire villages, someone still had to sit down with a ledger and account for the cost of a simple mended hem, the same unglamorous arithmetic that runs through any household, however grand, however ordinary, across any century you care to look. But there is one more object worth mentioning before we finally close. A small, unassuming thing that appears again and again in the household inventories of wealthy Versailles women, a simple wooden or ivory etui, a small case carried on a chain, or tucked into a pocket sewn discreetly into the folds of a gown, holding a needle, a small pair of scissors, a thimble, perhaps a tiny vial of scent, the practical, private tools a woman actually reached for in an unguarded moment rather than the grand, performative objects we have spent so much of tonight discussing. It is a small, plain thing compared to a diamond necklace or an embroidered court gown, and yet it travelled with her everywhere, through every ceremony and every quiet hour alike, a small fixed point of ordinary usefulness inside a life built almost entirely around performance, and I think it deserves its place in this story too. One last reminder that even the most extraordinary life is still, underneath everything, made up of small, practical, entirely human things. A skilled needlewoman among the court's own attendants often carried her own small etui as a badge of her trade as much as a tool, and the finest examples commissioned by the wealthiest women were themselves small works of art, inlaid with mother of pearl or fitted with tiny gold clasps, expensive enough in their own right, that they too found their way into the same household inventories as the grander jewellery we have discussed tonight. One more small proof that in this particular world, even the most modest, practical object could not entirely escape the pull of ornament and expense. And so, with that small quiet detail, one needle case among thousands of grander objects we have discussed tonight, I think we have finally walked through nearly every corner of this particular world worth visiting, from the freezing shift at the very start of the morning to the last small practical tool tucked away in a pocket at the end of a long glittering day. Let me tell you finally about the specific evening the whole day had always been quietly building toward, the moment right before sleep, because I think it deserves its own careful attention rather than being rushed past the way we so often rush past our own final waking minutes. By 1 or 2 in the morning, in the deepest, quietest hours, the enormous machine of Versailles finally genuinely slowed. The kitchens, which had been working since before dawn, banked their fires. The gardens, blazing with lamps only hours earlier for whatever entertainment the evening had called for, sat dark and still under whatever moon the season offered, fountains silent now, water settling back into ordinary stillness after a day of careful, choreographed display. Somewhere in the vast complex of buildings, several thousand people, servants and courtiers and household officers, were finally asleep, or nearly so, each in whatever quarters their particular rank had assigned them, from the grandest apartments with their own fireplaces and their own attending staff, down through smaller and smaller rooms, down finally to narrow servants' quarters tucked under the roofline, where the men and women who had spent the entire day making everything else possible now rested, briefly, before the whole cycle began again in only a few short hours. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, behind her own drawn curtain, in a bed she had not chosen, and in a palace she had not built, and inside a system she had been placed into as a 14-year-old girl crossing a border she barely understood, a woman finally closed her eyes. Whatever the day had asked of her, the shift and the stays and the panniers, the public dinner and the card table, and the dance performed exactly correctly in front of a room full of watching eyes. None of it followed her into sleep. Sleep, whatever else Versailles managed to regulate and ritualize and turn into performance, never quite figured out how to watch. It remains, even now, even after everything we have discussed tonight, the one truly private room any of us ever get to enter. No rank required, no curtsy, no correct order of hands, just the quiet and the dark and the simple, ordinary mercy of finally letting go. I think that is where I want to leave you tonight, in that same quiet, in that same dark, because it is exactly where you are right now too, wherever you actually are, whatever city, whatever room, whatever hour it happens to be where you are listening from. The palace we walked through together this evening is still standing, all these centuries later, its gardens open every morning to ordinary visitors who will never know most of what we talked about tonight, its mirrors still catching whatever light happens to fall across them. But the woman we followed through her day, and all the women beside her, the marquise fading gently toward the back of the room, the frightened 17-year-old at her very first ball, the lady-in-waiting dozing in a chair just outside a bedchamber door, finished their days the exact same way you are about to finish yours. Eyes closing, breath slowing, the whole enormous, complicated, glittering weight of the day finally, gently setting itself down. Sleep well, my friend. I will see you again soon, in another room, in another century, with another story to tell you softly in the dark. Good night.